results of the Senate leadership elections. And at 7 this evening, House Speaker Newt Gingrich's speech on the next Congress. And now, Washington Journal.
Good morning. It's Tuesday, December 3rd. Welcome to the Washington Journal. At the Supreme Court today, the Brady bill will be debated. And across the street at the United States Capitol, the Senate is scheduled to elect its leadership for the 105th Congress. Majority Leader Trent Lott and Minority Leader Tom Daschle expected to retain their leadership positions. And if you're just getting up and taking a look at your newspapers this morning, you may not have heard that the NASA has once again scrubbed its Mars Pathfinder launch. They're hoping for another launch on that tomorrow. We'll be talking about all these issues and more in our 3-hour edition of the Washington Journal this morning. Here's what we have planned. For our Daybook segment, we're going to be taking a look at the Supreme Court, the issues that are affecting the court this week and also in the upcoming term. Edward Felsenthal is our guest, and he is with the Wall Street Journal. He covers the Supreme Court. In our newspaper roundtable this morning, Michael Eric Dyson of the University of North Carolina and Dinesh D'Souza of the American Enterprise Institute join us. Then we'll be taking a look at a feature later about the Consumer Price Index. Bradley Schiller is our guest. He's with American University. We'll be learning about a proposal that the Washington Post says this morning will be a proposal announced tomorrow that will change the CPI to 1.1%. And at the end, we're going to be talking about the Blue Dog Democrats. Blue Dog Democrats were discussed in our program yesterday. A caller called in about a story that she had in her local newspaper. We thought we'd invite two Blue Dog Democrats to join us, explain what they do, who they are, and what their plans are for the 105th Congress. But we begin this morning by talking about the Supreme Court with Edward Felsenthal. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Fine, thank you.
First year at the court?
First year at the court.
What's it like in your first year covering the court?
It's a little overwhelming. There's an enormous volume of petitions that get to the court. The court, of course, only takes a tiny percentage of those cases, but a lot of what those of us who cover the court do is spend time reading the petitions and trying to guess what the court's going to do so we can be prepared.
I'm going to throw you a curveball and not
Sure.
start with the Supreme Court, but ask you to start with this case, which is on page 2 of your paper this morning, and it is a decision in a U.S. District Court regarding Charles Keating and the whole issue of the savings and loan in the 1980s. What's happened?
Well, this is obviously an enormous blow to the government. Charles Keating was the sort of symbolic figure of the S&L failure, the S&L problems of the 1980s. The government has spent several years and millions of dollars on this case, as well as a state court case against Mr. Keating. That conviction was also thrown out about 8 months ago. What happened yesterday was that the judge in the federal court that had convicted Mr. Keating decided that because the jury had heard about the state court conviction of Keating, the earlier state court conviction, Mr. Keating hadn't gotten a fair trial in federal court. And so the judge threw out that decision too. And now the government is basically back to square one. It's a painful blow to them and a real irony too. I mean, just I see all these cases that come to the court and you've got the government vigorously pursuing all kinds of arcane ways to combat securities fraud, the kind of S&L problems that we saw in the 80s. The government's really focusing in on the small details now, and here you have the biggest symbol of the problem back at the beginning.
He is now out of jail.
That's right. According
to the story by your colleague John Lippman. They were asked, a government lawyer involved in the federal case told the Associated Press yesterday the government absolutely would prosecute Mr. Keating again. And a little bit further down here in the story, they write, interviewed yesterday on the courthouse steps after Judge, is it Falzer? Do you know?
I'm not sure.
We'll try. P-F-A-E-L-Z-E-R. The decision, a beaming Mr. Keating was asked if he was happy about the latest ruling. Do I look sad, he quipped. Standing by his side, Mr. Keating's longtime attorney, Stephen Neal, said he was delighted. Any fallout on something like this? Either, I'm talking about the fallout politically, fallout on Capitol Hill?
I don't see how this is going to have a huge amount of political resonance. The policy debate has sort of moved on. The problems that were raised by the S&L crisis have, to some degree, been addressed. I don't think this is going to stir. This probably tells us more about the failings of the judicial system than about the S&L system, and he'll be retried.
To our viewers, we would tell you that in our first segment this morning, we're specifically talking about court cases and particularly Supreme Court cases. So we would ask you to dig into your newspapers and maybe find a story about some of the cases that are being discussed this week. And Edward Felsenthal is our guest. He is with the Wall Street Journal. He is in his 5th year with the Journal, previously covering a legal affairs issue. What kind of legal affairs issues?
Range of issues from employment law to murder cases.
2 years in New York, 2 years in Washington. He's originally from Memphis, Tennessee, a graduate of Princeton and Harvard. Let's jump to the case that's happening today at the Supreme Court. What is it? Being argued, I should say.
Today is one of the sort of hot-button cases of the term. This is the challenge to the 1993 Brady handgun control law. It's a law that imposes a 5-day waiting period, essentially, on purchasers of handguns across the country, and it requires, and this is the controversial part, it requires local sheriffs, local police officials to do a background check during those 5 days. Ironic, there's sort of a stealth issue. Legally, the case is important because it raises the question of what Congress can tell the states to do. This is not a Second Amendment case. You know, the Second Amendment gives us the right to bear arms, but nobody's asserted that that's the problem with this law. The problem with this law, the sheriffs, the 2 sheriffs who have challenged it claim, is that the federal government is essentially telling them as local officials what to do. And they say that, remember that the 10th Amendment that Bob Dole kept saying he carries around in his pocket, the sheriffs are saying this violates the 10th Amendment because it imposes on their prerogative as state officials.
The Washington Post editorializes on this issue today, and it says this: it is possible that the court will find fault with the division of responsibility for implementing the law that was set out by Congress. If so, the law can be revised so that federal officials can do the paperwork instead of local lawmen. How would it be revised? Would it have to go back to Congress?
Well, it would have to go. It would certainly have to go back to the Congress. One of the questions that the court will have to face, if it decides that the state official part of this case is unconstitutional, the court will have to decide whether to throw out the entire Brady law or just that portion. Either way, it would be a pretty porous law without the background check. Either way, Congress would have to revisit it. Actually, though, this is really only intended to be a temporary measure. The Brady law provides that 5 years out, there'll be a national computerized system, at least that's the goal, that would take care of these background checks. And so theoretically, in fact, in practical terms, by the time, it's possible that by the time all of this gets ironed out, we could be pretty far along with that system.
Who's arguing the case and for whom?
The case, there are actually 3 different cases challenging the Brady law. 2 of them are before the court today. Those are cases filed by sheriffs in Montana and the other in Arizona, both of whom object to the law. The lower court in both of those cases, it was the same court, the lower court upheld the Brady law. In the meantime, a court in Texas, an appeals court in Texas, has thrown it out. And that's probably why the court took it, to resolve that conflict.
A little bit later this morning, we are going to have with us on our newspaper roundtable 2 people who are very active in the issue of race and affirmative action. Dinesh D'Souza will be with us. He's the author of this book, The End of Racism, and Michael Eric Dyson, who is the author of Race Rules. My question to you is the Supreme Court taking any cases regarding affirmative action, any major cases this year?
Not really. You know, in some ways, Connie, this term is notable more for what isn't on the agenda than what is on the agenda. Part of the reason this is such a big week at the court is that you've got a couple of issues that have some political resonance and that are socially charged. The court this year does not have a major affirmative action case. There's no major abortion case this year, no major religion case this year. And it does have some, this Rehnquist court, of course, has been very active on issues of race and affirmative action. And there are a few voting rights cases on the agenda this year, but they are mostly fairly arcane efforts to elaborate on major voting rights decisions of a couple of years ago. So no, this is not a big year for race at the court.
Is there a reason why the court has not taken a lot of these kinds of issues up this year?
Well, of course, one area in which there's been a lot of ferment on the race issue is desegregation, and the court sort of spoke on that fairly authoritatively a few years ago in a case involving the Kansas City school system. I suppose part of the reason that you don't see a lot of race cases this year is that while this court has equivocated in some areas and has moved very incrementally in some areas, it's spoken fairly authoritatively on race questions. And so probably what you're seeing now is lower courts trying to sort out some broad rulings from a few years ago. These issues will creep back up to the court eventually, but things are sort of settling out right now.
Front page of the New York Times this morning is about a case that the court that was argued in the court yesterday. This was about advertising.
Right.
Why is it important?
Well, this is a case that's of enormous importance to the readers of my paper, the Wall Street Journal. The case basically involves these generic ads that you see, some of which you see on television all the time. The milk industry ads with the milk mustaches.
Mustache, yeah.
Pork, the other white meat, beef, you know, beef, it's what's for dinner. This challenge is filed by peach and nectarine growers in California who have who are required by a government structured system to pay a tax that funds these generic ads. And there's a similar tax that funds all of these ads that we see. The challengers to this program say that it violates their First Amendment rights, that they're in effect forced to pay for advertising against their will. And the reason this is important is that it raises the question of so-called commercial free speech, and that is, what are the rights of businesses? What are the free speech rights of businesses? It's a fairly uncharted area, and it's an area that this court, the Rehnquist court, has taken a lot of interest in.
Have a lot of companies joined this company in California on this case?
This has been a case that has drawn a huge number of friend-of-the-court briefs from other industries, other advertisers, and in fact that raised a problem yesterday for the lawyers arguing against the law. The lawyer for the fruit growers challenging the law really tried to make it clear to the justices that he wasn't saying that they had to throw out all of these programs, that if they throw out the nectarine ads, they also have to throw out the milk and the beef ads. It was an interesting scenario. Usually these lawyers who come before the court like to have as much support as they can get. In this case, so many people had thrown their voices in that it broadened the issue to a degree that apparently made the lawyer feel uncomfortable.
Let's take a few calls. Melbourne, Florida. Good morning.
Good morning.
What are you reading?
I was reading USA Today last Wednesday. I don't have my paper in today. And then that page in the USA Today that has all the states in it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one article in there, I think it was Colorado, and the governor's name was McNulty or something like that.
Governor's name in Colorado is Romer.
No, it's not Romer. It was an Irish name like McNulty or something like that. Well, anyway, he said in regards to a waiver he got in 1994, he was going to, excuse me, he was going to take out that part of the welfare reform bill that just passed, that he would ignore the part that said you couldn't give food stamps to legal aliens.
Mm-hmm.
And also he said he was just going to disregard that 5-year. You know, you couldn't, after 5 years, you couldn't get on welfare anymore.
Mm-hmm.
He said he was just going to disregard that altogether. And my question was, wouldn't the law just pass, the reform law that just passed, wouldn't that override that waiver he got in 94? Or what would happen as far as the the courts would. That's what the courts would probably do in this case.
Let's take it from the court angle. Do you think that any of the welfare reform legislation will make it to the court, will be challenged by states?
Almost every major piece of legislation winds up in the courts today. There will probably be challenges over funding questions, over the logistics of the waiver process. I don't think there's going to be any major challenge to welfare reform. It's not in any constitutional jeopardy, certainly.
Pittsfield, Massachusetts, good morning. You're reading the Boston Globe?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Pesselthal. I hope there would be a challenge to that welfare bill, but what I wanted to ask you was, a week or so ago, there was an article in the Boston Globe that said that the Supreme Court had ruled on whether a person has a right to know that they don't have to answer questions when they're stopped in a routine traffic stop.
Right.
And I was wondering, to me, I consider that a violation, a consumer rights violation. I mean, you know, businesses are told all the time what it must, you know, let people know, banks have to know, you know, let people know what interest rates are. I was wondering if there's any chance that the Senate and Congress could pass a bill mandating, you know, overriding the Supreme Court and mandating that people be told when they're stopped that they do not have to answer these questions.
Probably not. This, in some ways, raises the same question that we're hearing in the Brady case today. The court is, the Congress is going to have a hard time stepping in and telling local and state police officials what they have to tell motorists when they stop them. And so I don't really see how Congress can step in here. I suppose state legislatures might have a role.
Winchester, Virginia, good morning.
Morning. I was calling about the fruit growers case. I was interested, there are several large industries in the United States that aren't like fruit growers, where there might be some competitive advantage to selling particular products. And I was thinking most importantly, the electric utility industry, which is facing deregulation. I was wondering if you knew where any large utility companies had come out on the issue. They're required to support things like the Edison Electric Institute and and they do other collegial kind of things. Would this case have an impact on those industries that wanted to work together?
It probably wouldn't have an impact on cases that wanted on industries that wanted to work together. In fact, the people who are challenging the California fruit system say they'd really like to be able to, what they really want to do is do this voluntarily, the way the most famous examples of this are the sun-kissed orange folks and the sun-made raisin group. Both of these are voluntary cooperatives. The government doesn't have anything to do with it. And so if electric utilities or anybody else, as they're deregulated, want to get together on a voluntary basis, that wouldn't be affected by what the court does.
English only, another case coming before the court this week.
Yes, tomorrow
what is
morning. This is certainly one of the most socially charged cases on the agenda this year. There are about 20 or 30 laws now around the country, Arizona being one of them, which have laws that, states that have laws making English the official language of the state. Arizona passed a constitutional amendment that essentially requires government employees to speak only English, except in some very limited circumstances, such as when a police officer is talking to a suspect or somebody's trying to actually teach English. The law, the amendment, was challenged by a state employee, a Hispanic woman, who says that this is a violation of the First Amendment, that she has a right to speak whatever language she wants to, and that she needs to speak, in this case, Spanish, to be able to, this is a woman who processes medical malpractice claims, and she says she can't communicate with people who come into her office unless she's allowed to speak Spanish. So there's an enormous amount of attention to this case. It was a nationwide political movement to pass these laws.
Is this the ultimate case that the English-only movement was waiting for?
Well, in some ways, it's not a good case for anybody who wants an ultimate resolution to this, and that's because of an interesting political twist. The then governor of Arizona, when the law was passed, when the amendment was passed, decided not to appeal the initial ruling against the amendment. And so private groups have taken over the appeal. It's entirely possible that the court will not even get to the question of whether English-only laws violate the Constitution, but will just throw out the case and say, you know, the state's not interested, so why should we care? That would leave us a few years down the road before we got back to it.
Schenectady, New York. Good morning.
Good morning. It seems that this Brady bill, which is not explained in this paper. I do not know, for example, if a person in Montana and Arizona can purchase these weapons without a background check. Now, just because the sheriffs in these places have said, well, we're not going to cooperate. So are they processing normal gun purchases now as though there were no Brady bill in those places?
Of course, I'm not there, but they claim to be following the law. They certainly have to follow the law at this point. Well, I guess actually I take that back. I think since the appeals court ruled, they probably don't have to follow the law, only in those states, in the states affected by that appeals court ruling. But initially, the sheriffs in both Arizona and Montana did enforce the law, and that's one of the claims that they make. They say, we did this, we're a very small staff, we're a small town, and we did what you told us to, Congress. We processed dozens of these claims, these requests for guns, and we didn't find anything wrong. And you know, maybe one problem here and there. So part of their argument is that this was a big waste of their time.
I want to ask you, yesterday in this show we talked a little bit about Tony Morrow's piece in USA Today, in which through the Freedom of Information Act he got a hold of some documents over the weekend about Justice Marshall. And this is a kind of a follow-up story there, in which, which under the subheadline, scholars say the revelation of the Supreme Court Justice's cooperation with the FBI fit in with his pragmatism and his belief in working within the system. This story then has been kind of fanned out to the Baltimore Sun, Washington Post, Washington Times, New York Times this morning. Were you at all surprised about this story?
Well, a lot of news organizations have been chasing this material for a while, and the Freedom of Information Act requests have been pending for several years. I think that the scholars mentioned in the USA Today they have a point. Certainly, this is ironic. Marshall and the civil rights movement had an extremely antagonistic relationship, of course, with the FBI. But Marshall, Justice Marshall, when he was with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, really did represent the mainstream part of the movement, the pragmatist part of the movement that was trying to work for change within the system. And so there's some consistency there.
Tony Morrow writes, the revelations reinforce the late Supreme Court Justice's image as a pragmatic lawyer who did not want the civil rights movement slowed down by allegations of communist or pro-violence influence. That was according to Pulitzer Prize winner historian David Garrow. He also writes as a sidebar story on a different topic here, the whole issue of sales calls. Anybody who's been home during the dinner hour knows you get a lot of calls on the telephone. This is about the ones that are not a real person. What's this about?
30 states around the country, I suppose it's okay for me to say thankfully, have passed laws that basically prevent computerized systems from calling you during the day and making sales pitches. In other words, a computerized voice. A computer would dial your number, and then a mechanized voice would make the pitch. This is obviously extremely annoying to consumers. There was never really any serious threat to those laws. All the court did yesterday was turn away a challenge to the laws. And of course, anybody can file a lawsuit, and anybody can appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court, and that's what happened, and the court said, get out of here.
2 weeks of oral arguments?
This month, this week, and next week a much quieter week. Then we're back in January with really, if there are a handful of hot-button cases this term, 2 of them this week, the Arizona case and the Brady Law case, 2 of them next month, the Paula Jones case and the assisted suicide case. So these are the big ones we're watching this year.
Paula Jones case comes on, I think, the 13th of January.
That sounds right. It's certainly mid-month.
That would be about 8 days before the inauguration.
That's right.
And then what is the right to die case, or is this the suicide case?
A lot of people think of this as the Kevorkian case, but it's not. two states, New York and Washington State, are facing challenges to their laws that ban the kind of thing that Dr. Kevorkian does, assisted suicide, doctors who help terminally ill people in their lives. In both cases, most states around the country have such a law banning assisted suicide. In New York and in Washington, appeals courts said, no, you can't ban this, that people actually have a right to commit suicide with the help of a doctor. The court, I think this is a court that is not going to be receptive to finding a new right of this kind, and obviously they were, my guess is, eager to take it, probably to reverse those courts. As we take a look at this term, is there one justice that you are watching? Some terms, there are the types of issues that interest a certain justice. Does that happen? Does that occur in this term? There are two justices to watch this term, and they're really the two justices who, in some ways, are shaping what the legacy of this court. One, of course, is Chief Justice Rehnquist, who has an extreme interest in the issue of federalism, in this issue that's raised in the Brady Act, returning power to the states. And so I think that's part of the reason we've seen a lot of momentum, a lot of activity in the area of states' rights, including the Brady case. The other justice to watch is Justice Kennedy, who is probably the key pivot vote in determining whether Chief Justice gets his way in the area of federalism and some other areas that matter to him. A lot of the bigger cases of this year, as with last year, are likely to be decided on a 5-4 vote and could well turn on what Justice Kennedy decides. Edward Felsenthal is the Supreme Court correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, joining us this morning. This is his first year on this beat, but his 5th year with the Journal, previously covering legal affairs a couple years in New York and a couple years in Washington. He grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and he has a degree in public affairs from Princeton University and a law degree from Harvard. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. Appreciate it very much. Thanks. We're going to continue with the daybook section. We're going to broaden out a little bit and show you just a few of the stories in this morning's papers, and we would invite you to join us if you have a story that you would like to talk about. It can be broader than the Supreme Court stories now. We'll begin with this one. This is a Wall Street Journal back page. It's a Michael Frisby story about some of the decisions that President Clinton is making regarding his cabinet this week. He says that former Maine Senator George Mitchell was the top candidate to run the State Department, but the White House now acknowledges that there are 5 people in contention. And retiring Maine Senator William Cohen was leading the pack to head the Pentagon, but there is at least one other solid candidate in a whole new category of possibilities, executives from the defense industry. He goes on to say further that with Mr. Cohen's star fading, the White House has quietly sent out feelers for Republicans interested in serving as either Commerce Secretary or Energy Secretary. Such a move would cause a domino effect on other positions. It appears, for instance, that Democrat William Daley, a Chicago businessman, is now in line to head the Transportation Department, not Commerce. And the Federal Highway Administrator Rodney Slater, who would hope to be Transportation Secretary, may wind up at the White House as a senior advisor or a public liaison chief. Let's take a call from North Conway, New Hampshire. Don't know where it is. We'll try line 1. Good morning.
Good morning.
Where are you calling from?
Fresno, California.
Sorry, we got the wrong line. Go ahead.
Hello.
You're on the air, ma'am.
Yes. Yes, I'm from Fresno, and I was wanting to ask the question of the gentleman prior to this, but since the welfare is going to be all block grants to the governors, what does that mean with the states who have to give the more affluent states that have to give their money to help, say, like Mississippi or some of the poorer states? How can they take money, like, say, out of California and give to a governor when we have no representation? I don't get a vote for a governor or any representatives in Mississippi in those states.
What is your overall thoughts about this the whole reform proposal?
Well, I just can't see how they can take money from California, which is more affluent, and then I don't get to vote for the governors of the state or anything. And now my my senators and congressmen are not going to be in charge of it.
Well, the welfare reform bill is going to take a block of money and send it back to the states.
That's right.
Right.
I read where some states don't get as much back as they send in.
There's a certain formula. Mm-hmm.
Right. So if, say, for instance, I'm giving my tax money here in California,
mm-hmm.
they send it then to one of the poorer states. Some of my tax money is going to another state that I'm not going to have any representation with. And that doesn't seem, I thought we couldn't have taxes without representation.
Fresno, thanks for the call this morning. Let's take a call from Boston next. We'll get that Boston, or rather you have the Boston Globe from New Hampshire.
Hi.
Good morning.
Morning. My name's Catherine Trimble from North Conway, New Hampshire, and I read The Slippery Road to Campaign Reform from the Boston Sunday Globe by David Broder.
Mm-hmm.
And I have something that might be a positive or a negative thought. I'm not sure, but I think it might affect campaign reform rather than having a constitutional amendment. What I don't understand is why the U.S. senators and representatives, their salaries and benefits aren't paid by the state from which they are elected. For instance, New York State might decide $100,000 in health insurance. New Hampshire might decide to pay $80,000 in no benefits. And Ohio might vote to pay $70,000 in travel expenses. And therefore, the senators and representatives would be more in touch with people in their state, and therefore this might impact campaign reform as far as contributions go. Because
what would you pay a congressman?
What would I pay a congressman? I don't know. I'd have to leave it up to the people of the state to decide.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean in New Hampshire. If you were to vote, what would you pay a member of Congress?
Well, I'd have to look at all the different states and then decide what was fair. But I think things like each state would decide whether they gave them health insurance, and therefore, if states decided, oh, we won't give them health insurance,
mm-hmm.
then they might vote differently in Congress concerning health insurance bills.
Okay, thanks for the call. Let me show you a couple of the pieces on the Senate and what's going on with the Senate agenda in this morning's Washington Times. As we said earlier, there's a Senate leadership meetings this morning, and they will be announcing and deciding on and announcing their new leadership. There is one race, however, that is somewhat up for contention, and that is the race of the Secretary of the Republican Conference. Brian Bloomquist writes in this piece in the Washington Times that Senator Paul Coverdell of Georgia is the front runner in the race for the Secretary of the Republican Conference, the fifth highest position in the party's Senate leadership. Senator Conrad Burns of Montana is challenging Mr. Coverdell, but it doesn't appear to pose a threat at this time. Take a call from Fort Worth, Texas. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, Connie.
What are you reading this morning?
I was reading about in the business section of an Associated Press article says manufacturing at 6-month high.
Mm-hmm.
Manufacturing sector grew for the 6th straight month in November. Now, that and yesterday's television announcement that the U.S. dollar is up all over the world gives me pause to be thankful that this will be a good Christmas for a lot of people, I hope. But I'd like to make a point here about this. I'm not a pot smoker or anything like that, but I'm going to tell you something. To think that I've been told all my life that if you want a law to change or if you want something to make a difference in your life, go through the system and have the laws changed. We've been preached that. I'm sure you have too for some reason or another. Here the people have spoken in both Arizona and California regarding their decision on how to deal with a problem like this or to see how it happens. And here comes the government. As soon as you do speak up and go through the process to make a change, they want to stop it. It's just like I'm sure how the government did the Indians when they decided to take over what they wanted to. But anyway, that's really a silly point to make. But the point that I'm trying to make is that where is it? Where do you draw the line at going through the system to make a difference and having people just as soon as you do shut it down? I mean, I don't understand what you do in this, in this process to have an outcome done correctly. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. But hey, stay on the line for just a second if you can, because I want to show you this cover story in the money section of USA Today. Because you had mentioned some of the statistics that came out this week. And apparently the USA Today has done a 2-month investigation about government statistics in general. And it says that many of the government's numbers are just flat wrong, often by a wide margin. Goes on to say that the government is wrong 25% of the time in its calculation of whether the economy is growing or shrinking, that inflation is overstated at least 1 to 1.25 percentage points, and that productivity growth, a key factor in measuring U.S. living standard, is being understated by 3/4 of a percentage point. This is all coming in these couple days ahead of the decision on how to handle the consumer price index.
Well,
what do you think of those numbers?
Well, that's their opinion. It also means that 75% of the statistics are correct. So, you know, even if it's off some, you're still running ahead. Now, if they were 50% wrong, then that would give you a cause for alarm, I would think. Thank you very much, Congress.
Okay, thank you. I also want to show you, we'll be talking about this in just a few moments, that the Washington Post has on the front page of its business section this morning an article that is kind of scooping the decision, and that's going to be announced tomorrow, about the Consumer Price Index. And it says that the Commission is going to recommend tomorrow that they slow the growth of many federal benefit programs by 1.1 percentage points annually. This is according to some sources. We'll talk about that in just a few moments. First, we're going to go to Laguna Hills, California. Good morning.
Good morning. This is Maggie. I read the Orange County Register.
What's in it this morning you want to talk about?
The English-only propositions that we have going.
Right, and also earlier we had talked about that case being before the Supreme Court this week.
We don't speak English. We speak American. American's an inclusive language. We don't even hyphenate or we don't even italicize words anymore that are from other languages. English is an exclusive language. American is an inclusive language, and it would bind us all together if we include more of the foreign phrases and so forth in our language even than we do now.
How would we do that?
Well, it's coming about naturally. And just like we do use computer speak and we use political speak, we just include more of the foreign words and so forth into the language.
Okay, Laguna Hills, thanks for the call. I want to show you a front page story from this morning's Washington Post. It's not in very many of the other papers we get here, but you can take a look to see if it's in your paper. It's a story about Paul Farhi under the headline, TV Industry Agrees on a Rating System. And it says that beginning next month, there's going to be a new rating system for television programs. It is not going to be based on the rating systems of whether there's too much violence or too much sex, but it's rather going to be rated like the movies, somewhat like a G, PG, PG-13R, or an NC-17 that will be based on age. And it talks about it here, about the fact that that's being discussed and that it might go into effect as early as next month. We'll be talking more about that in our second section of our day book, which will be coming up in about an hour and 20 minutes. We'll be right back.
Later in the program, our newspaper roundtable with Michael Eric Dyson, a professor at the University of North Carolina, and Dinesh D'Souza of the American Enterprise Institute. And coming up, we'll talk with American University professor Barry Schiller about how the Consumer Price Index is currently constructed. But first, astronaut Shannon Lucid received the Congressional Space Medal of Honor yesterday. Here's a portion of the White House ceremony.
When Dr. Lucid began her education, it took faith as well as intellect to be a female rocket scientist. Now she has exceeded a universe of expectation. Perhaps more than even she knows, she set a remarkable example for a new generation of young Americans, especially young women, who look up to her and see possibilities that are new and uncharted for their own lives. Our young people, like those who are here today, will be doing work that hasn't been invented yet. Many will be doing work, as I have often said, that has not been imagined yet. We owe it to them to continue in the American tradition of pushing back the frontiers of knowledge. I now have the honor of presenting the Congressional Space Medal of Honor to Dr. Shannon Lucid, the first scientist and the first woman to receive this award. What she did while journeying among the stars is a proud example of what all of us should try to do more of here on Earth.
Thank you very, very much. I am deeply honored to be here today, and I am deeply honored for this award. Thank you so much. But what I'd like for you all to remember is this is not just one person. This is not focused on one person. What this flight really was a story of two nations, two great spacefaring nations that cooperate together and work together. And it's just a foretaste of what can happen in the future. And I think sort of the thing that symbolized the entire flight was one evening, Yuri and I were sitting or sort of floating around after supper, and we were talking. And we were talking about our childhoods and how we each grew up mortally afraid of each other's nations. And then how we were sitting there on a day-to-day basis, working together, laughing together, having a good time together. And to the three of us, this seemed like just a small miracle, something that we never would have thought of when we were children. And I think that this is sort of the take-home story from this flight and from the work that we'll be doing on the International Space Station. Thank you very, very much.
Washington Journal coffee mugs are now available. If you'd like to order one, call 1-800-523-3174. Washington Journal continues.
We are back live this morning with Bradley Schiller, who is a professor of public administration at American University. Good morning.
Good morning, Connie.
This is the front page of the business section that we showed our viewers earlier this morning. Clay Chandler and John Barry have this piece in which they say that tomorrow the announcement is going to be made to change the consumer price index by 1.1 percentage points. What does that mean?
What it means is they will reduce the rate of growth in measured inflation in the United States, and that'll have an impact on all cost of living adjusted benefits and salaries and taxes. So for people who are retired on Social Security, their benefit checks every month now are adjusted by the rate of inflation. And basically what the government's going to do, if they follow the advice of the panel, is reduce the measured rate of inflation and therefore reduce the rate of increase in benefit checks.
This has been being talked about for a long time. Why now is it coming to a head this week?
Because Congress has come to an impasse on the budget. They're looking for ways to balance the budget, painless ways. And Congress is afraid to explicitly reduce people's benefits or raise people's taxes if they change the index that determines those benefits and those tax increases. Then through the back door, they will have reduced benefits and raised taxes.
Michael Boskin, who is the chairman of this commission, this advisory group, advisory commission, which is supposed to make this announcement tomorrow, and writes in his, the Clay Chandler and John Barry write in this piece that congressional budget sources say they expect Boskin to urge that the major changes in the way the CPI is calculated be made on an administrative level rather than as a result of any specific legislation. He says that such a move would spare legislators a formal vote on benefit reductions.
That's exactly the point. It's a backdoor way of reducing benefit growth over time. But for Boskin to say do it administratively, that's a little bit disingenuous, since basically the politicians are holding the feet of the administrators to the fire and say you must reduce the CPI index.
The USA Today gives us a little idea of what the impact of a change might be today, in which they have their cover story is actually all about bad data and a 2-month study that they did talking about the American government data, which I will ask you about. But underneath it, it talks a little bit about who gets these adjustments. 47 million Social Security recipients. I don't know if we can come in a little bit closer here and show this. 47 million Social Security recipients, 27 million food stamp recipients, 4 million military and civil service retirees, 26 million children who get aid for school lunches, 2 million private workers covered by union wage contracts, and 119 million federal income taxpayer brackets and personal exemptions. How do those federal income taxpayer brackets?
Because federal income tax rate brackets now are indexed to inflation. So if the rate of inflation goes up, the tax rate actually comes down. And if we eliminate then or reduce the CPI adjustment, then the tax rate doesn't come down as quickly as it has before.
Let's back up a little bit and figure out what the Consumer Price Index is. You brought props this morning. Why do we have these things? We have eggs, milk, bread, Pampers, and hamburger on our table this morning.
Well, it gets to the question of how the CPI is actually measured. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is responsible for measuring price inflation, and basically what they do is they go shopping for exactly the same basket of goods and services every single month. There are 400 federal shoppers who go shopping every day in 85 different cities, and they buy 184 different items like the milk, the bread, the Pampers, and the eggs.
Same brand,
Same brands, same products, week after week, month after month. And basically all they're doing is comparing the cost of buying exactly the same market basket from one month to another.
How do they choose what to purchase?
They choose what to purchase based on what consumers actually buy. So there's a survey of consumer expenditures done every month that asks people what they spend their money on. And so once we've determined what basket the typical American family buys at the grocery store and the department store and the auto lots and so on, once we know how people are spending their money, then we can define the basket of goods, as we've done here.
So we took, for instance, this Pepperidge Farm Hardee's slices, $2.59. If that price went up 5 cents from one month to the next, what kind of impact would that have on the Consumer Price Index?
Well, it would depend on how large bread figured in the average budget. And of course, bread expenditure would be a very small percentage of the average consumer's budget these days. So if a nickel a loaf increase in the price of bread would have a very small impact on the CPI.
Now, you brought with you a book that you authored on a lot of different issues, but in it you give us a market basket. Explain this chart, and hopefully we can come in pretty close. There we go.
So again, we have to start with a notion of what consumers spend their money on. What is the market basket? And so surveys of consumer expenditure tell us that the largest item in the typical consumer budget is for housing.
31.8%.
Exactly. So that means that 31.8 cents out of every consumer dollar is spent on housing-related services and goods. The second biggest item is transportation. Then you see food. Food gets roughly 17 cents out of every dollar. Out of that, bread would be a very small component. So bread would be much less than 1% of the consumer budget. And then the other items the consumers spend their money on: health, entertainment, recreation services, etc. And so the 184 items that make up the consumer basket are all reflected in that pie chart.
And how does the Consumer Price Index take into account something unusual in, let's say they had always done a certain kind of insurance. You have insurance down here. They had always priced a certain kind of insurance, but that insurance changes.
Well, that's one of the problems with the Consumer Price Index, is that the content of the market basket does change. We don't buy exactly the same food items, exactly the same kind of insurance, exactly the same kind of housing services every month. So roughly every 10 years, the market basket itself is revised to reflect the changes that have taken place over the previous decade in the way consumers spend their money. So you have two kinds of definitional problems. One is to define the market basket and changes therein, and then to identify changes in the items in the market basket.
We'll open up our phone lines and invite you to join us if you have a question for Bradley Schiller of American University this morning on this whole Consumer Price Index, how it works and what changes could be made in it. You'll see the phone numbers at the bottom of your screen, and we also have a fax number and an email address that we will also show you at the bottom of the screen. So taking this into account, this information goes where?
It goes to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, which analyzes all the data that's coming in every month. And again, I want to emphasize that it's a massive, ongoing, daily process to determine the price of the different commodities. These 400 federal shoppers, if you will, are visiting 19,000 stores in 85 different cities every month. And they're keeping track of the changing prices of Pampers, milk, bread, insurance policies, etc. And that's how we know what's happening to prices.
How far do we have to go back to understand the origin of how this was all put together? The CPI. I mean, who dreamed it up?
Well, there's a long-standing interest in knowing what's happening to prices, because people measure their economic well-being by their income in relationship to prices. And so we want to know how fast our incomes are going up relative to prices, and when incomes are rising faster than prices, our well-being is increasing. So you can say, as long as we've had prices in a market system, we've wanted to know what's happening to prices.
But we have had a consumer price index for
I'm not sure what the origin is. It would be back in the 1930s, I believe.
Let's go to Champaign, Illinois first. Question. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm wondering how the CPI determines the index, and how they can just use an average person or an average family for this index.
What do you mean, caller? How they can use an average family?
I mean, what don't they determine? Do they determine whether or not people with disabilities who have to eat special foods, do they take that in consideration? And now that they're going to lower the annuity levels according to the price index, how this is going to affect people who have limited incomes and maybe on special diets or whatever.
Okay, thank you, Professor Schiller.
Yes, they use an average to approximate what's happening to prices, but clearly not everyone buys the same market basket. So disabled people or older people would have a different market basket than, say, a young family with small children would have. Not everyone's going to be buying Pampers at the grocery store.
These are not on my list, I'll tell you.
Not on my list any longer either. We still need some profile of the average, and then special studies are done to see whether the average is relevant, say, to the older population or to different groups.
Another call, Dublin, Ohio. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Schiller. I don't believe that pie chart was yours, but the pie chart you were just displaying, I think there was a significant omission in that you have housing marked there at 31.8%, transportation at 19%, food at 17%. I wonder if you added into that pie chart taxes, how that would impact the entire pie chart and the percentages that you have displayed in that pie chart.
Right. The pie chart that's displayed in the text is prepared by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it refers to how the consumer dollar is allocated, and that is after taxes. So you're right, taxes are not included. It's consumer expenditure and how it's spent on the various goods and services.
If you were to put taxes in here.
Well, taxes take roughly 25% of consumer income. But again, we're asking how consumers spend the money they have left after taxes on goods and services.
Ambrose, Georgia, good morning.
Good morning. Curious, he just said something about 25% taxes down here. I just figured it up the other day, and taxes are taking a little over 58% of my net income. My comment, though, about the CPI, I wonder why they don't have a separate CPI for people in the agricultural sector like myself. If he doesn't think we have inflation or more than 3%, he ought to go try to buy a tractor and then wait a year and ask about the price on that same tractor. The price of fertilizer up 30% in 1 year. Right now, the price of propane fuel to heat our poultry barns is up 80% in 3 months. Why don't we ever hear anything about this? If they took an agricultural CPI and just kept that separate, they would see what a heck of a disaster situation that many farmers are facing.
What kind of farmer are you, caller?
Well, we mostly poultry, tobacco, peanuts, cotton.
Thanks.
Well, the Consumer Price Index measures only the basket of goods and services consumers buy for household use. The kind of cost increases you're talking about are measured by the Producer Price Index. There's actually 3 producer price indices to measure the cost, for example, of your fertilizer and your energy cost to run a business.
Let me just go ahead. I'm sorry. I wanted to show you this cover story again from the USA Today. Bad data, flawed economic reports rattle the markets and rifle pocketbooks. Beth Belton said they have done a 2-month study and that many of the government's numbers are flat wrong. She goes on to say this, and I'd like to get your opinion on it. The government is wrong 25% of the time in its calculation of whether the economy is growing or shrinking. Inflation is overstated by at least 1 to 1.25 percentage points, and productivity is being understated by 3/4 of a percentage point, according to some people.
According to some people. The problem is that no one has better data. I'm not here to defend the government's data, but it's the best available information we have. And I think what that story is pointing out, that the numbers are often revised as better data becomes available. And so, for example, the growth of the economy is measured 3 times by the Commerce Department. And so there's a preliminary, advance, and final report on what the growth is. And I think what that article is suggesting is that there's a big change from the preliminary number to the final number.
For those people who are just consumers out there interested in what's going on and see all these numbers and their eyes kind of glaze over, is there one number that they can kind of pay attention to where they can get a feel for how the economy is going?
Yeah, I think these numbers are very reasonable. It's not so much a question of whether the CPI is precisely measuring the cost of living, but whether changes in the CPI. Let's assume just for the moment that the measuring stick is wrong. But if we continue to use the same measuring stick, are we measuring changes in prices over time? Even if we didn't measure prices correctly the first time. The same for the economy. If we're not measuring the state of the economy perfectly because we've excluded one sector or mismeasured another, is the measure good enough to measure changes in the growth of the economy over time? And I think on that basis, the government does a fairly good job.
Syracuse, good morning.
Yes, good morning, C-SPAN, and thank you so much for the program. My question this morning, actually I have 2 questions. There have been several references to the financial term inflation. And for just the common man, I was wondering if the professor can provide me with a regular guy definition or explanation in my first question. What is inflation and how is it measured?
And your second question, caller, let's go ahead and take both of them.
The second question was is how do social programs, if you would, such as welfare and any kind of other payments of that nature affect inflation? Thank you.
Well, in the first question, inflation is simply a change, an increase in this case, in the average price the consumers pay. So if we're measuring inflation by the consumer price index, it's a rise in the cost of that fixed basket of goods and services that the typical household buys every month. In terms of welfare payments, if we pump more money into the economy, that could tend to push prices up. But the cause and effect tends to be the reverse. The benefits go up. The outlays for some kinds of welfare programs, and particularly retirement programs and pensions, go up as we conclude that prices have risen.
Professor, go ahead.
So an increase in the CPI drives benefits higher as opposed to the reverse.
Professor Schiller, he grew up in San Francisco. He has an did some undergraduate work at the University of California, Berkeley, and graduate work at Harvard University. He's been at American University for 18 years. And what kind of classes do you?
Basic economics,
economics.
Micro and macroeconomics, as well as studies in income distribution and welfare.
Louisville, Kentucky. Good morning.
Good morning, and good morning, Mr. Schiller.
Good morning.
Thank you for taking my call. When you're talking about the market basket prices of goods that the average consumer has to consider every week when we go to the grocery store, I wonder how that's figured in this consumer price index, because if you ask the average housewife or husband who is going out and doing the grocery shopping every week or every 2 weeks, my cost of putting food on the table, and I would submit to you that I am purchasing pretty much the same products that over the past 15 years of my marriage that I have been purchasing, less the 5 years of my children's infancy and the Pampers and necessary things that were added on through that time period. But when I go to the grocery store, the cost of my buying 2 weeks' worth of groceries has gone from $45 every 2 weeks 10 to 12 years ago to $120 to $25 every 2 weeks for essentially the same items. My cabinets and cupboards are no fuller now than they were then.
Well, even at modest rates of inflation, which the government estimates have been in the range of 3 to 4% over the last 10 years, adds up to a very substantial increase in the weekly cost of buying groceries over that period. So you're talking about maybe a 45% increase in average prices. Now, in reality, food prices have risen faster than the price of other goods and services. The cost of computers, Many services, educational services, have come down over time, offsetting the increase in the price of food. And remember that the average consumer spends only 17% of their total consumer budget on food alone. Your rent, your transportation costs, your insurance costs, all these things loom larger in the household budget than food costs alone. So even while food prices are jumping, the total cost of living may not be rising as fast.
If these proposals, which are talked about in the Washington Post article, and changes in the CPI go into effect, will it change the types of that we have here on the table that will be a part of the basket?
No, it won't change the market basket of goods, because that still depends on how consumers actually spend their money. What would change is how much of a price increase the BLS, the government, attributes to various goods and items. The big issue there is the changing quality of goods. And the argument is that the quality of goods is improving very quickly. Part of that quality improvement is reflected in the price, and we should adjust the apparent price increase for the quality improvement.
Could you give an example of that?
Automobiles and computers are the two most prominent examples. If you go back over time, your last caller, for example, talked about the price of groceries 10 years ago. We'll go back 20, 30 years ago and look at the price of a car. The best-selling car in 1958 was a Chevy Bel Air. It sold for less than $3,000. The best-selling car today is a Ford Taurus. It sells for $18,000 or $19,000. So you say, wow, the price of cars has just skyrocketed over time. But we have to ask, is the 1958 Chevy Bel Air the same car as a Ford Taurus in 1996? And the answer is clearly no, because there's been a long list of improvements. Everything from anti-lock brakes to reductions in auto pollution, to airbags, etc. So it's a very different car.
Those types of quality changes are not taken into consideration now, or they are?
They are, and the argument that the Boston Commission is making is they don't think that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does a good enough job in adjusting for those quality improvements.
Lake Village, Arkansas, good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to ask about, first of all, everybody doesn't buy cars, food, I mean, the cars and the computers and all that. The things that I buy is going up. But my question is, years ago, recipes went a lot on you get one can or a 7-ounce package, and those are just numbers I'm drawing out of the air for this recipe. Now then, the cans have shrunk down to like 14.5 ounces. The other items have shrunk down, and instead of buying one can of something for a recipe, you end up buying 2 cans. And I just want to know if that kind of thing has been taken into account.
Yes, the government, in measuring the prices, actually looks at how many ounces are in the can and how large the loaf of bread is, and so on. So they do take into account the changing size of the item as well as its price.
Old Town, Florida, good morning.
Yes.
You're on the air, sir. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm on there.
Yes, you are.
What I'd like to know from him, one lady just asked him about said that some of us buy. Everybody buys food, but doesn't everybody buy computers and automobiles and other big things? And the groceries and medicine and so forth, that all keeps going up, but that seems not to be too much of a factor. They want to talk about these other things. And another thing, I understood him say something about he was involved in the welfare thing or something there, or used the word welfare. And I keep hearing them on this program and on and when the Congress is in talking about what they're going to do for the poor and this, that, and the other. And I hear Ted Kennedy doing all these things, and people that are multi-millionaires and billionaires sitting up there in Congress, and they're plumb willing to take our money, the taxpayers' money, the little man's money, and spend it to take care of people that don't want to work, wouldn't work if you give them a job. In fact, I knew a man that was offered a $4.50 an hour job when welfare, or when the minimum scale was $1.65, and he refused it because he said he could get more money off of welfare.
Okay, thanks, Florida. Let me ask you whether a change in the Consumer Price Index would have any impact on programs, federal programs for the poor.
Primarily through the food stamp program, which is indexed to inflation, but the primary cash benefit program, the aid to families with dependent children, is not indexed. And so, in fact, benefits don't rise with inflation. And
Why
in
is
most
that?
states,
Do you
they've
know?
actually gone down because it's left to the states largely to determine the benefits, whereas the food stamp program is congressionally mandated to be a national program.
Now, we've talked mostly about how this is all put together, but in coming up with the change to slow the growth by 1.1 percentage point, that also means that people's paychecks, some paychecks will be lowered?
It's not that the checks will be lowered, but the expected increase in the paycheck would be smaller. So particularly for, say, union workers who have typically a cost of living adjustment in their pay scales, or for federal workers who have cost of living adjustments in their paychecks, what they'd find is that their paychecks don't rise as quickly as they would have with the old CPI, or the existing CPI measure.
And would that be a comparable 1.1%? Of the rate of...
Well, for example, this year, for federal workers in the Washington area, they're getting a 3.3% increase in their pay. If the Boskin Commission's recommendations were accepted, you lop 1.2% off of that, so they get only, say, a 2.1% increase in their pay. So again, it's the increase in pay that is reduced.
And that's also for the numbers that we were talking about earlier, the 47 million Social Security,
exactly.
Military, you mentioned civil service retirees, food stamp recipients. How about this 26 million children who get aid for school lunches? How would that work?
Again, because it's a cost of living adjustment in the cost of food, that would not occur, or it would occur to a smaller extent than it did before.
Now, you've come and you've explained all this to us. Do you have an opinion on whether this should be done or not?
I think that the Boskin Commission is a political cop-out. That there's lots of problems in measuring the cost of living, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics did not do it perfectly. No one has come up with a better way of doing it. If the Boskin Commission had to do their own consumer price index, people from across the political spectrum would find problems with it. And so just to lop off 1 or 1.2 percentage points arbitrarily seems to me the wrong way to go. If we want to address the budget deficit, then we should directly address the problems of Social Security benefits and Medicare payments and tax payments. Congress has to face up to the problems with the deficit, not use a commission to change the way we measure economic activity.
Bradley Schiller is a professor of economics at American University. He's taught at AU for 18 years and grew up in San Francisco. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. We appreciate your help in understanding this.
Thanks, Connie.
And the Washington Journal will continue in just a few moments.
Later in the program, we'll talk with two members of the Blue Dog Democrats about their plans for the 105th Congress. Our newspaper roundtable is next with Michael Eric Dyson, a professor at the University of North Carolina, and Dinesh D'Souza of the American Enterprise Institute. But first, here's a look at the C-SPAN school bus.
So we're on the Pacific Plate. So if the San Andreas gets active, we might be beachfront pretty soon. Who knows? Okay, and then the water down here, there's 19 percolation ponds. We import water from the Colorado River that comes down the Whitewater Wash. It settles in the percolation ponds, and then it soaks in about 1,000 feet of sand into our aquifers underground.
It's a large district. It stretches from the eastern suburbs of Riverside, the city of Riverside, through Riverside County all the way to the Arizona border. It's a pretty diverse district. Here in the valley, that it's separated by a string of mountains that separate the east end and the west end of the district. It's generally a combination of some of the most incredible wealth you'll ever see and just incredible poverty. There's a lot of millionaires, billionaires, people who build their own golf courses. That's the incredible wealth that is here. But there's also quite a bit of well, I guess the people who work for the millionaires and the billionaires. A lot of the residents of the district are either Mexican citizens or we have a lot of people. We were surprised at the paper when we did try to figure out who was registered and who wasn't. A lot of the people weren't registered because they were non-citizens. The major city is probably Palm Springs, not necessarily in terms of size, but in terms of influence. When you think of the district, you think of Palm Springs because generally the representatives come from Palm Springs. We probably have one of the more colorful representatives. Sonny Bono is our representative. He as I'm sure most people know, was an entertainer. He started in the Sonny and Cher program, and he kind of carries that around with him wherever he goes. When people meet him, they know Sonny and they know who he is. So he got into politics. He originally, I mean, this is a guy who didn't even graduate high school. He got into politics when he was living in Palm Springs in the mid-'80s. He had a restaurant, and he was having problems with the sign ordinance. So he decided, you know, I'm going to take this to the city council. Wasn't satisfied with the outcome. Decided to run for mayor. This was in 1988. He had, I mean, when you talk about political outsiders, that's Sonny Bono. He hadn't even registered to vote until 1986, 2 years before he ran for mayor. So he runs for mayor, wins another couple terms as mayor, decides he wants to run for Congress, and wins overwhelmingly. You know, it's not all what I would expect to find out here. When you hear Palm Springs, you do think of the wealth, the movie star image, the resort image, but it really is it's a community that has the diversity that you'd expect in Southern California. It's an interesting area because of the diversity, because of the wealth, because of the poverty, because of the heavily Latino influence, particularly being so close to the Mexican border, and because there are areas, you know, that are just barren desert out here. You can go for miles and miles and see nothing, and then you see small groupings of trailers. It's really hot in the summer and just beautiful in the winter.
The C-SPAN school bus tour continues. Today, one bus visits Winston-Salem, North Carolina. The other bus is in Tucson, Arizona. Washington Journal continues.
We are back live this morning with the Washington Journal, and joining us on our set, Dinesh D'Souza, who is a research fellow at American Enterprise Institute and also an author. Good morning to you.
Hello.
Your first story that you'd like to share with us this morning.
Well, I see in the Wall Street Journal that there's an article about how Wall Street is getting behind the idea of Social Security reform, which is an interesting issue because there's a generational tension building up, in a sense, between the baby boom generation, which is now becoming older, grayer, preparing to think about retirement, and a younger generation, which is smaller in size, which is essentially funding or is expected to fund the retirement of the older generation. This is going to be difficult. It's going to create some problems, and so Wall Street apparently is looking at some ways to think about privatizing the system, because it's expected to run out of money in a decade or so.
You've talked a lot about issues of race in your books. Is this a different kind of separation that you see coming? An age separation?
I think, you know, my broader interest is in the issue of equality. The Declaration of Independence, in its grand assertion, says all men are created equal. All persons are created equal. But it doesn't say equal in what respect. Equal in looks? No. Equal in intelligence? No. Equal in speed? No. Equal only in rights. And so when we have tensions between blacks and whites, men and women, heterosexuals and homosexuals, immigrants and natives, the older generation, the younger generation, these produce some interesting questions about what's fair, what does equality mean in this context, and so that's why my interest in the issue.
Also at the table this morning, Michael Eric Dyson, who is the author of a book called Race Rules, and you also teach where?
At the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Thanks for joining us this morning. Your first story?
Thanks for having me. Well, I'm looking at the jury that found against Circuit City stores, which allowed a constant pattern of racial bias against its employees, two of them, in fact. And I think the interesting thing is that this is only a further index of the enormous tension in corporate America, where the boardrooms continue to be mostly male, mostly white, and mostly exclusive of those diverse opinions that constitute American culture and certainly make real American democracy. And what's interesting here, of course, is that Circuit City, Mitsubishi, allegations against Avis, Texaco, and so on, really give the lie to those who claim that American society has, in one sense, progressed way beyond the time when we have necessity for legal remedies for discrimination, and how American culture continues to wrestle with profound forms of anti-democratic racism.
How much money are we talking about here?
Well, here it's only about $300,000 in damages to two people. I think $225,000 to one, $47,000 to others. But it's not quite a class case suit, but it is a suit that suggests that there's a potential for a lot more employees, and thousands of employees from Circuit City have caught up around the country suggesting that they were similarly subject to racist discrimination by that company.
Is this a case that you've been watching?
Well, no. I mean, this, you know, Circuit City, we've been watching in a sense corporate America, and every day, every other day, it seems to be somebody else pops up with a story, although this case has been being prosecuted for a while. I think that what it does indicate is that there's a lethal pattern of racial discrimination that continues or persists in American society, especially in corporate America, and that along with CCRI in California, along with debates about affirmative action, along with the debates about the differences between the races and how the black middle class is expanding, and yet the irony, or indeed the paradox of that expansion, is that while the black middle class has gained, you know, access to circles of American privilege heretofore denied to them, that they continue to be subject to forms of racial discrimination, and more importantly, forms of what we call the glass ceiling, where people are able to view what it is that they seek to attain by virtue of being employed by these corporations, and yet they're denied them. And I think along with women, this glass ceiling often turns to cement.
Did you read this story? Did you?
I did, and I think one of the puzzling things about many of these cases today is that they don't involve discrimination of the traditional sort. In the Texaco case, for example, which was in the papers lately, there was an echo of the old-style racism. Someone said, we found these tapes, and there are these corporate executives in blue suits talking about niggers and making all these racial epithets. A few days later, it turns out that that particular inflammatory term wasn't used. And the argument was, well, we've got to go ahead and boycott Texaco anyway. And the answer is why? Is it because someone has proven that, many people were denied promotions at Texaco? No. The point is that what happens in these cases is we are using a logic of proportional representation. So if blacks are, for example, 10% of the population, the assumption is, hey, when you're looking at the board of directors of Texaco, 10% should be black. If you're looking at the student body at Berkeley, 10% should be black, and so on. And this is really a terribly flawed assumption. So I think one of the things that these cases prove is not the flaws in corporate America, but the flaw of the assumption of proportional representation that drives these cases. Why should we assume, in the absence of discrimination, that every group will fan out into every sector of the workforce at precisely its ratio in the general population? There's no reason to believe that.
Well, it wasn't proportionality, I think, which is the exclusive criterion by which people were judging these cases. The reality is that it's not simply proportionality in terms of the percentages of black people in the population. Especially in the Circuit City case, it was predicated upon black people being denied access to jobs that white people had access to routinely, who were inferior in terms of their preparation, in terms of their education, in terms of their capacity to do the job. And furthermore, many of the Circuit City employees were forced to train their white underlings, if you will, who then got jobs higher than them. So I think that it's not about proportionality, it's about justice, and it's about democracy, and the way in which in the workplace those abstract principles have to be applied with a direct force, and the degree to which the Constitution and the courts have to protect the access of those minority people, regardless of their proportion in the population, to those jobs for which they are eminently qualified. So it has nothing to do with proportionality and fanning out into those areas of American culture, a diversity argument. It has to do with justice.
Well, would you agree with me, though, that these cases are prosecuted with a kind of a broad brush? For example, we talk about class action suits. Now, at Texaco, for example, there's a $175 million settlement. Much of this money will be distributed among thousands of employees. Now, there's really been no showing that these thousands of employees have been victims of discrimination. There might have been a showing in the Circuit City case of 2 people. And maybe in the Texaco case, one could say that this particular manager who was guilty of these remarks and so on, or the particular guy who shredded the documents, should be held culpable. But it seems to me, isn't there something odd in saying that every black who works for Texaco should get a 10% raise? So you essentially will have black and white employees working in the same job or in the same level, and the black guy is getting 10% more money than the white guys. Is that fair?
Well, I think that what's flawed is your assumption there. First of all, when they talk about a class action suit, the presumption is that a whole range of people who fall in that category have been subject to similar treatment. If it was predicated upon proving every case every specific instance of racial discrimination. I think the Texaco case proves quite clearly that people destroyed evidence, that they deny certain crucial evidence that might come forth that would substantiate the plaintiff's claim. And more than that, I think that the atmosphere, the ethos of racial discrimination and racism is so thick and so powerful that it certainly doesn't lend itself to a kind of empirical verification of every instance of racial discrimination. What it does suggest, and I think that what Mr. D'Souza has to take account of, is the degree to which across the board with many corporate American corporations, that this pattern of racial discrimination has to be dealt with, and the persistence of racial discrimination has to be dealt with by the courts, and those people whose rights have been denied them have to be protected by the courts as well. So I think that's the most important thing and salient factor that we have to force ourselves to deal with.
Another story. I'm sure we'll get back to this.
Well, there's an interesting article here about, in the Washington Post today, and it's about the dealings between the Republican Congress and President Clinton, and the fact that the Republican Congress now is taking a softer, a kindler, gentler approach. Trent Lott, the new Senate Majority Leader, says, I'm not going to go for a revolution. I'm going to go for a pragmatic, conservative transformation of society. He says, we don't want to fight, we want to get things done. And that, of course, echoes a lot of what President Clinton has been saying. I think it reflects a kind of new consensus mood in American politics. Less ideological. Now, admittedly, the debate has shifted dramatically to the right, so that the terms of the debate, when one is talking about welfare or civic order and so on, we're talking about conservative ideas, and President Clinton, in a sense, has run as an Eisenhower Republican. So one of the things that I think made him very difficult to beat, particularly by a moderate Republican opponent. So I think we're going to see a rather lackluster second term, not one defined by grand ideological conflicts, but one defined by accommodation, but within a conservative framework.
Another story?
Well, to piggyback on that in a sense, I think that there, in the Washington Post this morning, women's groups seek entry to President's Inner Circle. And precisely what Mr. D'Souza has referred to as the Eisenhower Republican mandate of President Clinton, I think bodes ill for many so-called minority groups, especially women. And I think that one of the keen debates within the Clinton administration will be the degree to which it is able to look beyond narrow frameworks for understanding racial justice and understanding gender justice. That is to say, in the first administration, it was pointed out that Mr. Clinton was much more vigorous in attaining the notion that American culture should reflect in his cabinet the degree to which we are racially diverse, we are gender diverse, and so on. In this instance, it seems to be that white men continue to be the people to whom he turns and from whom he gets his information about certain key aspects of our country in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. And I think that women have a very powerful claim here. They along with minority groups, put Mr. Clinton in office, and to what degree is he now responsible to them, not only as a special interest in a constituency, but as really acknowledging that these votes were crucial for him maintaining his presidency, and to what degree is he responsible now to putting women in those key positions, especially in terms of his National Security Council, where, of course, Ms. Albright is being considered for Secretary of State. So I think that this indicates, again, that Clinton is wrestling with internal problems about what gender justice is about and how that should be reflected in his own administration.
Now, in about an hour and a half, we're going to be covering a news conference in which a group of Asian Americans are calling for representation in the cabinet.
Sure. Well, I think that's fine. See, here's the problem. What we end up doing is we end up looking at democracy, we end up looking at racial representation, we end up looking at all these issues of justice as, well, there's another special interest group. And all the while, the most powerful special interest group, white men, are being protected by a cloak of universality. They are assumed to be the standard from which we judge all other participants in American democracy or in the political game. And unfortunately, what happens is that other groups begin to compete in a kind of musical chairs sensation for the bits and crumbs that are tossed out. Instead of, in one sense, criticizing that kind of modus operandi of the American political game, where we dole out crumbs and the spoils to those who are the victors, in a sense, we end up protecting the most powerful group, who itself is not subject to the same kind of criticism as a special interest group. And I think that's very deeply problematic.
So you're saying the whites get protected, white males get protected?
I think white males get protected in a very powerful way. And I think that all those other minorities, so-called women, African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, and so on, get cast as, again, they are the ones who are fracturing the possibility of American democracy and pulling with the rug of special interests, the good out from the beneath the table for everybody. And I think that's a very problematic understanding.
Just mentioned to our viewers that we'd invite you to join us this morning. You'll see the phone numbers at the bottom of your screen, also our fax number and our email number, or email address rather, if you would like to contact us this morning with a question or a comment for our two guests. Your reaction?
Well, on this business about a cabinet that looks like America and whether or not a woman should be a Secretary of State and so on, I guess my problem is with one word in that formulation, and it's the word looks. Because it appears that what the president is pursuing is a cosmetic diversity. Look at the Clinton cabinet of the first term. Most of the, a vast majority of the cabinet members were attorneys. Apparently many of them ate regularly at Washington's exclusive jockey club. Perhaps by the end of the second term, a goodly percentage of them will be indicted. I don't know. But my point is, this is a homogenous group, politically, ideologically, culturally. In what sense can it be said to reflect the true heterogeneity of the American population? We want to talk about gender justice. Why don't we talk about religious justice? How many committed evangelical Christians are there, for example, in the Clinton cabinet? Evangelical Christians as a group are larger in number than Hispanics and blacks put together. So it seems to me that this politics of racial or gender apportionment is fundamentally flawed, because the essential assumption behind it is that if Madeleine Albright is Secretary of State, she will bring, in some sense, a woman's point of view, or will represent women in some sense, whereas it's not clear that that's why women voted for Clinton, and it's not clear that that's how American democracy is best served.
Well, I think that it's not simply the case that when we talk about representation of what looks like America, that this radical heterogeneity you're speaking about, I certainly want to see it as well. First of all, the flawed assumption is that evangelical Christians cannot be black. You act as if they're mutually exclusive
categories.
saying,
why reduce it to race? Why not look at religion?
But I'm saying that when we look at religion, we're including black people as well. That's my point. You're including women. So you act as if there are no women who are black and evangelical as well. The point is that there's a complex array of interests that are being represented by a lot of people in President Clinton's cabinet, and to talk about racial representation is to speak about the way in which, and gender justice is to speak about the way in which historically in American society those groups have been disadvantaged and excluded from participation in the cabinet positions in our democracy. All I'm arguing for then is not simply a special handout to those groups, but to acknowledge if we really want to deal with a democracy in American culture, we really want to deal with political representation, we have to go across the board.
But what a change from the civil rights movement, where in the early 1960s, the ACLU filed a petition with the government saying, the government can never ask what your race is. They should remove the request to list your race in all forms. Now, the Census Bureau now is facing a dilemma, which is that you have a lot of mixed-race children, the product of intermarriage between different groups, Asians and whites, whites and Hispanics, blacks and Asians, and so on. And these people are literally beyond racial classification. So our multiracial democracy is making the idea of fixed racial categories, as well as racial preferences that depend on those categories, increasingly obsolete.
Let me ask you a little bit about your book. It's new. Yes. Addison Wesley is the publisher. Race Rules. What's it about?
Well, it's about specifically the kinds of issues we're dealing with here this morning. Affirmative action. It deals with the Million Man March. It talks about black public intellectuals. It deals with the O.J. Simpson case. It deals with the relationships between black men and black women. So it's a kind of panoramic viewpoint, if you will, of contemporary race relations and the specific sites of crisis that have really provoked African Americans to reflect upon the future of this country vis-a-vis issues of race and how racial democracy can be made real.
This chapter headline jumped out at me. Black folk lifted by their bootstraps should beware of heels.
Yes. Well, what I'm speaking there about is the degree to which this self-help ethic that has pervaded black culture from the very beginning. I mean, many conservatives act as if for the first time black people are hearing a lesson about self-help, when indeed the central strategy of African American amelioration and progress has been self-help, because that's the only help we had. So what I'm speaking about there is to be cautious and careful about self-help ideology, both in the form of Colin Powell and through the rhetoric of Minister Louis Farrakhan. I think what's interesting is that Minister Farrakhan is often given credit for being revolutionary in terms of race relations, when indeed some of the most conservative values and virtues are being smuggled under the rhetoric of reaction against white supremacy. His reaction against white supremacy is powerful. His smuggling, if you will, of very conservative beliefs about culture, about pathology, about what reproduces black malaise is, I think, very problematic and needs to be paid special attention to, as well as Colin Powell being put forth as the nice Negro substitute for O.J. Simpson in the collective psyche of American culture. Until the point, that is, when Mr. Powell was thinking about really making a run for the office, and his wife indicated that these nasty hate letters that he received really should be the reason that he should reconsider. And all the pundits were going, why is it that, you know, Powell is not running? Well, he wants to live longer. He wants to make his money for his speeches, write his memoirs, and continue to function as a productive member of American society.
Where'd you grow up? In
Detroit, Michigan, in the inner city of Detroit, and went to school there and listened to Motown, Smokey Robinson, and Stevie Wonder, and Diana Ross, and Aretha Franklin.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to school undergraduate, well, in Detroit I went to Northwestern High School. I went undergraduate to Carson Newman and did a PhD in religion at Princeton.
All straight through?
No. I had several stops along the way. I didn't go to college until I was 21. I was a teen father, welfare father, hustled for a while and so on, worked in factories, went to college at 21, called Knoxville College up and said, do you have a spot for a young black man aspiring to get an education? They said yes. The next day, in the words of Sam Cooke, I grabbed an armful of Greyhound and went down to Knoxville, Tennessee, and began to pastor and go to school there. And homeless for a little bit and struggled a little bit, but also made progress toward my educational goals.
What do you mean you hustled for a bit?
Well, when I say hustled, my father was laid off after 33 years of working in a factory in Detroit. And as a result, refusing to go on welfare, we began to hustle in the sense that we began to get jobs, painting. We began to do a grass cutting business, sodding business, and we did little odd jobs, whatever it took to get money into the house.
This is your fourth book?
My fourth book, right.
How's it doing?
Doing very nicely, and hope C-SPAN exposure will help to do even better.
Mr. D'Souza, this fall, your book came out in paperback. What's been the impact of your book?
Well,
on your life, first of all.
When the book first came out in hardcover last fall, it created a bit of a storm of controversy, and that's because it went beyond the familiar affirmative action debate. I started out to write a rather simple book. I wanted to see why the idea of colorblindness, which has been promoted by black leaders going back from Frederick Douglass through Booker T. Washington all the way to Martin Luther King, when American society reluctantly, and not without a fight, finally said, okay, we will change the laws and make them race neutral. Many of the same people who fought on the barricades with King within a few years said, well, that's not really what we want. We want you to take race into account after all. And I was interested in how this momentous change occurred so quickly. As I looked into it, I realized that it was not a simple story. It involved rethinking fundamental institutions like segregation, slavery, and so on. And so the book ended up being more of an octopus than I originally envisioned. It generated, as I say, a storm of controversy, in part because there were a lot of raw nerves in the wake of the Simpson verdict, the Million Man March. And so a year later, I'm taking stock of the criticisms of the book, and it's a reevaluation, if you will. I have a new essay in which I look at what people said about it, where the debate is now, and where it's going in the future. One of the interesting points that puzzles me, and this is perhaps where Professor Dyson and I are coming at it from different angles, is I'm an immigrant to this country. And most immigrants today are non-white. They don't come from Europe. And from the immigrant point of view, America works very well. We see horizons of opportunity. And that's partly, I suppose, because in India, if you have to work for $2 a day, and then you come here and someone says, I'll pay you $5 an hour, that's a huge pay raise. But when we come to this country as immigrants, we encounter African-American leaders who say to us, wait till you've been here a few years. The American dream is a big hoax. It doesn't work. The invisible hand of racism will keep you down. And one of the questions I wanted to ask is, who's right? Is the immigrant perspective correct, or is, in a sense, the African-American perspective right?
Well, I think that that's, again, a false dichotomy being put forth here. First of all, African-American leaders are not. I'd be pressed hard to find out a black leader saying to immigrants, wait and watch because the American dream is a hoax. What they have been saying is that the American version of the dream vis-a-vis African-American people has been deeply flawed and problematic. And not only African-American people have said that, visitors from distant shores have said that the American dilemma, Gunnar Myrdal, or Alexis de Tocqueville, who talked about the tremendous flawed nature of American democracy, especially in regard to people of color. So I think that there's no questioning that both foreign observers of the American scene, as well as indigenous African-American leaders, have said that the American dream is certainly an ideal after which we should strive, but has never been realized for African-American people, and that recently arrived immigrants have much more immediate access to the benefits of that dream than those of us who have been here, whose blood has been mixed with this soil, and whose sweat and a tremendous labor has built the institutions of American democracy and the society in which we live. So I think there's a much different framework for developing issues of race than you've talked about here.
We need to get to the phone calls, but I need to ask you, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Bombay, India, and I came to this country as an exchange student. And when we talk about the immigrant point of view, the interesting thing is many people think of immigrants in terms of the Asians, the Koreans and so on, who are doing reasonably well. But it's interesting if one looks, for example, at the Haitians or the West Indians or immigrants from Africa, from Nigeria and so on. Many of these immigrants who are no less black are nevertheless able to enter the middle class, reach the professions, their daughters do well in school, they assimilate relatively quickly. Even their rates of intermarriage into the American population are greater. And you use the word access, which is an odd word. It's unclear to me why a Haitian or a West Indian should find better access to the American dream than an African American. I think that there are cultural factors, cultural differences that explain why West Indians do better. And that's one of the arguments, the central themes of the end of racism.
Well, we could... Oh,
we need to get to some phone calls, and we'll get back to this. Warren, Michigan, you're first up. Thank you for waiting. Go ahead.
A question for Professor Dyson, please. At what point will the professor consider the victimization of blacks over with? Is it 10%, 20%, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, 500 years from now? It seems to me that this is an ongoing excuse given to people that want to fail.
Sure. Well, I happen to disagree with that, and I don't think we can set any time limit. I can tell you one thing, it ain't here yet. I think that the reality is in American society that there's an ongoing pattern, not only of racial discrimination, but a more powerful ethos that I think that my colleague, Mr. D'Souza, is not being fair about representing. I think that there's not simply the laws on the books. There's a whole kind of attitude in this country that prevails that disallows the progress of African American people, that actively discourages them from participating in the mainstream institutions of our society. So that when we look at cases like the Texaco case, or we look at instances of institutional racism that persist in American corporate structures, we know that across the board, that in poor black ghettos, that these practices of racial discrimination that segregate and segment people into these enclaves of civic terror called housing projects. When we look across the board, both in terms of black middle class and in terms of the black poor, there are deleterious, lethal consequences of racism that continue to exist. So if we say that people are merely pimping this victim language, I think we have to look at not the people who are being pimping it, if you will. Those who are continually being victimized have a legitimate claim, and I think that what we have to examine is the degree to which our society is willing and complicit in the process of making sure that they remain on the bottom. And I think that's a deeply problematic flawed structure of American democracy that we have to address.
When you look at what's wrong with our housing projects, one of the things that's wrong with them is you have drugs sold in the hallways, you have graffiti on the walls, you have urine in the street, you have shootings and so on. And the question you have to ask is, who's causing all this? Why are the housing projects so dangerous? Isn't it because there are very dangerous people living in those projects? And if there's any negligence or if there's any racism, it seems to me, it lies in the failure of the government to enforce crime protection. It's in the failure of the government to basically insist that certain sets of minimal standards be observed. So it seems to me that we're looking at two things. I mean, historically, you're right. And because you're right historically, every time there's an example of racism in the paper today, you say, aha, look, that's further example that American society hasn't really changed. But I'm part of a generation where if you graduate from law school and you go to a decent law school and you're African American, you have 100 law firms doing backward somersaults to recruit you, in which there is in American society an incredible willingness to accommodate, even a bending over backwards to avoid being insensitive, to avoid giving offense. And I say a special sensitivity to blacks that's in fact not observed to other people in the population.
Well, you'd have to, I mean, again, first of all,
society is different.
Yeah, well, there's no question that society is different, but there are some things, that I think some evidence that is not different at all. So when we point to these evidences, you know, we're playing a kind of catch-22 no-win game. On the one hand, if we substantiate the claims that racism persists, we're looked at as if, oh, we're bean counters looking for yet another example of racism in American culture. On the other hand, if we ignore it, we do so to our own peril. And I think that, again, your immigrant analogies are faulty here. And the way in which we look at American society as this nirvana, or at least when you say it bends over backwards for these black people who become lawyers. Let's track them for the next 10 years. Let's talk about the way in which when they gain access to these corporate structures, when they gain access to private firms, what is their rate of making partners? To what degree are they still being burdened with the rage of the black middle class that Ellis Coast speaks about brilliantly, that prevents them from enjoying the fruits of American democracy?
Palm Bay, Florida. Good morning.
Boy, you know, this is perhaps the most depressing conversation I really have ever seen. And I'm a Democrat, married to a woman from Trinidad, so you could say that I'm really bending over backwards for the professor here. It's sad, because I could see this conversation 20 years ago. And can you say, have the blacks in this country done any better in the years that have passed up to the 90s? I would say no. And the fact of the matter is, and I know this is going to be very difficult, and I don't mean this to be derogatory or insulting in any way, but you have to look at yourself and you have to say, who is the problem here? Is it the white people, or is it perhaps a pathology of our race? The comparison is, of course, Africa, where there aren't any white people, and the misery and butchery that goes on there is truly sad.
Thanks.
Well, look, on the point about racism, part of it, this question is a matter of the angle of vision. If I woke up in the morning and said to myself, I live in a racist country, and I looked for evidence to confirm this, I would find plenty of examples throughout the day that would confirm to me, yes, this is a bigoted society, and my destiny is not in my own hands. But the wonderful thing about American mobility and American opportunity is that we are able to get ahead, even in a flawed society, even as a society that does not offer nirvana, because we say, even though we are not fully in control of our own destiny, we have to act as if we were. We have to take responsibility for many things about ourselves that we didn't create. And we do that in our own lives. We have a genetic endowment. We have a social environment that was created by others, by our parents, by our society, by our schools. And yet we have to take responsibility for where we end up in life. So the message of responsibility is not a denial of societal responsibility. It is an essential complement to it.
Sure. Well, there's no question about that. And as I began the program, I think that traditions of self-help within African-American communities are strong precisely because people of color, especially African-Americans, have recognized that. But it's not an either-or, it's a both-and. I think many black leaders, from Jesse Jackson, to name a recent example, back to Booker T. Washington and before, talked about the necessity for African-American people to work within their own communities to constitute a better society. All we're saying, and what I'm suggesting to this caller, is that it's not that simple. It's not a matter of self-help, because black folk by themselves did not get into the condition in which we find ourselves and cannot, by our own actions and efforts, remedy the structural problems that prevent American democracy from flourishing within African-American communities. Secondly, I think what's very important, the caller said he didn't mean to be insulting, but certainly was in a certain degree, because to talk about the pathologization of black people without talking about the pathology of white racism, the real pathology here is white supremacist thinking, which continues to infect broad visions of American democracy. And until we remedy that, I think white folk would rather blame black folk than deal with their own pathology. And so what I'm calling for white Americans to do, and for African Americans, is to talk about responsibility within a historical and a political framework. And when we talk about responsibility, it seems to me that America wants black folk to be responsible, doesn't itself want to be responsible. I'm saying to white Americans, be responsible for what you created. Be responsible for the degree to which you have created the structural pathologies that you see evident in African American culture, and be willing to admit that you caused them, that you helped create them, that they flourish, yes, perhaps with a life of their own within those structural confines of these black ghettos, but then intervene with aggressive measures that will then remedy or ameliorate those conditions. And in that sense, I'm willing to acknowledge that it's a two-way street.
This email in from Mr. D'Souza: how can you be so blind when it comes to the access to opportunity for people of color and women in areas of private industry leadership and cabinet positions? What has not been addressed is the cultural and distinct values that each ethnicity and gender brings to the table. While I may agree that proportionalism is not the answer, we have yet to find the answer to the legacy of racism and obviated access to opportunity.
Well, I think this notion of color-coded perspectives in the workplace is inherently flawed for the following reason. It assumes that there is a link between race and culture. It assumes that the fact that I have a brown skin gives me a certain point of view, and that's absurd. White people disagree on all kinds of issues. So do brown people, so do black people. Now, it's true that the African-American population is a little bit different in the sense that historical experience has created, in a sense, a culturally similar group. And so, for example, if you look at voting habits, for example, even middle-class blacks tend to vote quite similarly with poorer blacks, and so on. So there's an interesting exceptionalism in the black community, but by and large the idea that race determines a point of view, I think is itself the legacy of racism, is a pathology of white racism. We have to get away from that.
Richmond, Virginia, good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to comment on the articles in the Richmond Times-Dispatch this morning. Circuit City cited for glass ceiling. U.S. jury upholds 3 of 15 bias complaints.
That's the same story we've been talking about here that we started off with, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, I missed that part.
That's all right. Go ahead.
But it does say that, yes, the biggest question before it, the jury said that a pattern of practice of discrimination exists at Circuit City's West End office. However, it does say also that only 3 of 15 claims in which a plaintiff said they were denied promotion because they were black were decided against the company. Also, they only awarded them, the jury imposed relative light back pay, compensatory, and punitive damages against a multi-million-dollar electronics retailer, a total of about $290,000. But guess who gets the big bulk of this? They've also awarded legal costs. The lawyers will get $1 million in the case they started in 1993. Of course, there is one other thing that Circuit City does have the right to appeal, and they say they will appeal. There was also an article in the Richmond Times-Dispatch on Sunday about these discriminatory cases that only about less than 1 in 10 has found any merit at all to them. And I guess if you take enough cases to court, you're going to win some of them.
Okay, thanks.
It's a pretty safe bet.
Thanks, Richmond. Let's go ahead and take another call. This one from Irvine, California. Good morning.
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Dyson and Professor Souza.
Go ahead.
I've experienced an interesting phenomena. It's kind of anecdotal. For the past 6 years, I've had a exchange program with East Africans. And about 15 of them that have come and worked in my laboratory have all said the same thing. And that is that they have never really experienced any white racism when they were here, but rather experienced racism coming from black Americans once they found out they were Africans. Is that a general phenomena? And if it is, why would that occur?
Mr. Dyson?
Well, I think that what you're dealing with here is a small sample, number one. Number two, I think that certainly there's a tremendous deal of tension between indigenous blacks, so-called African Americans native born, and those blacks who come from Africa, those blacks who come from the West Indies in particular. There are tremendous tensions in many African American communities between those groups. And what that is predicated on is not simply the relationship between race and culture, but a couple of factors. First of all, many Africans and many Caribbeans are themselves used to running their own countries, ruling their own countries, and seeing in important positions in their society black faces represented. So that issues of race to them are not as crucial as issues of fair access to justice, fair access to democracy, and the degree to which those goods are distributed, predicated upon a explicit and just standard. Within American society, those standards, I think, are in one sense compromised by the tantalizing factor of race for African American people. So that when African Americans view the culture, they view it through the lens and through the prism of their own historical experience, where they have been denied access to those realities. Many Africans and many Caribbeans, however, have benefited from a culture where they themselves have been in control, and therefore they come here and saying, why are you black folks so caught up with racism and racial justice when we don't see that at all. What we see is an X, Y, and Z. So that's one of the reasons for the tension. The second reason I've talked about in terms of these differences is in understanding that for African American people, there's not this exoticization going on. There's a kind of exotic element attached to many foreign-born black people than those who were born in this country. And so those tensions are more cultural than they are racial, but I think they have a tremendous degree to do with how black people and how Africans and how Caribbeans, all black people of course, relate to one another in this country.
Well, I think one of the things we are seeing here is that many, there's been an excuse industry that is basically saying that you can't succeed in the inner city because look at the conditions there. No wonder people are driven to crack, no wonder people are driven to crime, no wonder you have broken families and so on. These immigrant groups, it was earlier, a century ago it was the Jews, then a decade ago it was the Koreans, today it's the Haitians, the West Indians. They moved to the inner city. They emphasize not government dependency, but entrepreneurship. The small store is critical as a ladder of success. High savings rates, low illegitimacy rates, and within a generation, they've moved to the suburbs. Professor Dyson is right. You have African Americans who've been here a long time saying, where the heck are you going? Racism is supposed to be keeping you down. And yet these groups are showing tremendous upward mobility. And so I think the resentment against these groups is rooted not in the fact that these groups, the Jews, the Koreans, are oppressing blacks, but they are out-competing native blacks. And this is creating a certain amount of envy.
Well, I think it's not that simple. I mean, if we talk about the recently arrived immigrant groups and the degree to which they have access to certain business loans and so on, and support from the government, but beyond that, not only the kind of informal support, formal support, but the kind of informal support, the ability not to have the legacy of racism hanging on their back, and the degree to which their abilities are not questioned as a result of their own skin privilege. And in fact, it's the opposite is true, that they are assumed to be hardworking, they're assumed to be diligent. As a result of those assumptions, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They are then allowed to work in American society in ways that black people are never presumed to be able to do. And secondly, there is some real resentment. The Korean-black tension in L.A., the powerful tension between Arabs and blacks in Detroit and so on, does speak a historic legacy of different historical experiences, but it doesn't deal with the fact that what I talk about, this exoticization of the other, the immigrant that comes to this country without the baggage of the lethal assumptions about their intelligence, about their capacity, about their culture, about whether or not they have the relative degrees of pathology that prevent them internally from succeeding, as opposed to these politically imposed restraints from the outside.
I'm going to ask you each to get another story ready, and while we take another call from Brooklyn. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. And I would like to say good morning to both of the professors on the panel. My question, first my statement is that until white America, until society actually says that there is racism in America, we will always have this conversation. Mr. De Sousa, you are viewing racism based on an immigrant from India. And the minute you set foot on this soil, you are not viewed by America as an African American. You are viewed as an immigrant and seen differently, completely different. Your view on racism in America will be different because you are seen by America differently. I'm an African American of Trinidadian descent, and I was never brought up with the color in our family. We were all different shades, all different colors. We intermarried and everything. But I am aware that there is racism in America. I, as an African American woman, will see it, and my son will too. I do not let him use this as a scapegoat that he must go on, but he will come against it. And for you to sit here and say that it is because of the way we as African Americans do not try to progress, there is a form of racism even when you try to progress. It's there.
Brooklyn, thanks for the call. Mr. Sousa?
Well, I'm not sure I really disagree with much of what you say. I mean, no one denies that there is racism in America. I think what we're arguing about is how much and whether or not this racism is systematic or whether it is episodic. I think what I'm saying now is that racism historically used to be the main problem suffered by blacks and perhaps to a lesser degree other minority groups as well. Today it is a problem, but it's no longer the main problem. And in fact, if racism were to disappear overnight, this by itself would do nothing to raise black academic test scores or increase black savings rates or strengthen black families or reduce black-on-black crime. These problems have taken a life of their own. But I do agree with you that what two black writers in the New Republic some years ago called rumors of inferiority, this toxic essence of racism is particularly directed at African Americans or toward the black population and doesn't affect other immigrants to the same degree. I think you're quite right about that. I say that.
Well, but I think Mr. D'Souza is not dealing with the fundamental premise here. Her premise is that, first of all, you're exempted from some of the same baggage that certain African Americans are subject to, not simply the rumors of inferiority, but the real empirical evidence that a government has acted upon those rumors. It's not like a conspiracy theory of white racism that cannot be substantiated. It's substantiated in cases like Texaco, in cases of corporate America, as well as across the board in American society. Number two, I think that if racism is destroyed tomorrow, certainly the savings and loan rate and the black crime rate will be affected because people kill where they live. White people kill white folk, black folk kill black folk. And if we have integrated communities, we might have the prospect of integrated killing, which is not a very powerful prospect to look forward to in terms of our racial democracy. But here's the point. The point is that we have to deal with beyond these kind of labeling of broad issues with immigrants versus African-American indigenous people. What we have to talk about is the degree to which there is a tariff imposed upon African-American people here. And American society continues to benefit from what has been called the discounted value of racism and sexism. That is to say, if you are a person of color or a woman working in a corporation and you have discounted labor, you are working for less money than a white male makes, then that whole corporation, and indeed by extension American society, is benefited from the discounted labor of racism and sexism. It is to the advantage of the entire society to do away with these incremental and, as you say, systematic and episodic events. And number two, this society will benefit if we are able then to remove the tariff imposed upon African-American identity and move toward a society where we have everybody participating without regard for race, color, and gender.
I'm afraid the tariff is in your brain. I mean, the thing is, the problem here is not the tariff. The problem is that in a multicultural society, we can learn from each other. And it seems to me that groups, like individuals, can learn from each other. We have to look at what are the cultural strategies that promote success in America today. Then you have to ask, if you want to be at Berkeley, if you want to be in the boardroom at General Motors, if you want to get ahead and have the rewards of American life, and some people don't, then you have to follow these strategies, which work well. So,
but nobody's been denied. I mean, I think within African-American society, you're acting as if black people don't have awareness of this, that they have not done so prior to the fall of racial discrimination.
Well, look,
that's all I'm suggesting, that African-American people have been doing the very things you're talking about, have been paying attention to the need for education. The hunger for literacy has impelled African-Americans forward since we landed here in slavery. So what I'm saying to you is that it's not that black folk have not taken seriously the lessons of self-help. It's not that they have not paid attention to how they must get beyond victimization or scapegoating. Most African-American people I know, you're talking about straw black people that I've never met. Most black folk I know want to get up in the morning, survive against the odds, send their children to school, save for their futures, and are willing to make an investment in the American dream somehow, and sometimes to their own peril. So I don't see any of this operating in African-American communities where black people have denied the reality of that.
I need to jump in here. San Diego, good morning. Well, San Diego's gone. Let's go ahead and go to your next story.
Well, a very interesting story in that Thurgood Marshall turned to the FBI in the 1950s because he feared communist efforts to infiltrate and influence the NAACP. I think that what's interesting here, of course, is that even a great freedom fighter like Thurgood Marshall, who was unquestionably committed to the erasure of every symptom of racial injustice in American society, was himself subject to concerns about the so-called radical element of the black freedom movement and the kind of pervasive fear in the 50s of the red alert. And I think that unfortunately what that denies is the degree to which a person like a W.E.B. Du Bois within the NAACP was certainly influenced by and had a tremendous influence on not only communist belief, but certainly progressive radical beliefs and social beliefs and socialist beliefs in American society. And I think this is one of the sad elements or small chapters in an otherwise heroic life of a figure who was committed to justice across the board, regardless of race, gender, class, and so on.
Some historians said today that it was just that this was a part of Marshall's pragmatism.
Well, certainly, but you know, one man's pragmatism may be another person's opportunism. I think that in this sense, Thurgood Marshall was responding to the heat being applied to all black liberation groups for them to be American and to be pure. What's interesting, of course, is that the FBI was carrying out one of the most widespread surveillance efforts, not only against black radical groups like the Panthers, but 1,200 pages on Mr. Marshall himself. Or there are records of FBI files against not only Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., but Paul Robeson as well. So I think that the FBI certainly has never been the friend of African-American people. And for Mr. Marshall to turn to them bespeaks not only the horror and the tragedy of being coerced to comply with one's own enemies, but also the degree to which he was unable to see that those progressives who were radical, those progressives within African-American culture who were looking for remedies for racial justice were his friends and not his enemies. And to turn them in based upon communist influence is to really misjudge the degree to which African-American struggles have been indeed heterogeneous in terms of their ideological beliefs.
Is this going to have an impact on his legacy in the minds of black Americans?
Well, it will give power to those critics of so-called mainstream African-American leaders that, aha, here again we find black folk cooperating with the enemy, eating from their same table, even as they claim to be eating different meals. And I think the reality is that Thurgood Marshall's legacy is very powerful and will remain, but there will be some chinks, if you will, in the armor, and there will be some chipping away at the degree to which he was completely committed to justice for black people.
He's a complicated figure, Marshall. In fact, he went from himself in the Brown decision. Marshall said, all we are asking is that you allow Linda Brown and the other plaintiffs to go to their neighborhood school. We are asking for a race-neutral treatment on the part of the courts. A few years later, Thurgood Marshall said, and William O. Douglas quotes this in his autobiography, he says, you guys have been discriminating for 400 years, now it's our turn. In other words, he argues that the way to fight discrimination against blacks historically is now to have discrimination against whites, the exact opposite of what he had said a few years earlier. The other thing about Marshall and the FBI is that we forget that the Communist Party, which is today a kind of a joke, was in the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s a real force. In the aftermath of the Great Depression, the Communist Party had over 1 million members, and there's no question that for communists, it has always been difficult to find an American proletariat because there isn't the class tension in American life that you see in other parts of the world. But there is a kind of resentful class in America, and in a sense, it is urban poor blacks. And so communists have always been attracted to the cause of the urban poor black, believing that the urban poor black, no interest in civil rights for its own sake, but a sense that this is the vanguard of the future revolution in America. And so Marshall was aware of all this, and I think he was trying to be basically a patriot.
Well, I think that African-American people have had little choice in terms of choosing their allies, and that I think
Maybe
that
so.
The Communist Party certainly has been one of the most powerful anti-racist movements of whites in American society, number one. And there have been tremendous studies. Mark Nason's study of communists in Harlem during the Depression, Robin D.G. Kelly's tremendous study of communists in Alabama during the Depression at the same time. It indicates that African Americans saw their destiny tied up with issues of class and with issues of race and how they were linked together, despite the Communist Party's demand at some points for them to subsume race under class. I think that the communists have been tremendous allies to African-American people. Number two, I think that the history of the NAACP itself grew out of a coalition of whites and blacks who were radical, who were willing to challenge the basic presuppositions of mainstream civil rights orthodoxy that later on became attached to the NAACP. And I think that Mr. Marshall was caught in the crosswinds. Thirdly, I think that Malcolm X said, listen, I wrote a book about Malcolm X a couple years ago. He says you can stick a knife into somebody's back, pull it out in 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches and call that progress is ridiculous. You can't call that progress. And I think that either we're going to deal with the fundamental knife in the back of African-American and other minority peoples, or we're going to take it out, or we're going to acknowledge that we have a flawed system that needs to be remedied. And I think that in Mr. Marshall's case, when you talk about the Brown decision, you keep referring to this notion of color blindness. Those people did not mean by colorblind what you mean by colorblind. They talked about race neutrality as a strategy being deployed by African-American people to make a racist white society acknowledge its principles of democracy. They did not thereby mean that we should be ignorant of or ignoring of the constant, persistent influence of race and class and color upon our consciousness and about how our democracy operates. So color blindness and race neutrality are two different terms that demand historical context and political context for them to be deployed successfully.
I'm going to have to jump in here again. Memphis, Tennessee, good morning.
Yes, I think that that's probably one of the problems right there that the professor just spoke of, that one of the things that white people find so pervasive is that if you disagree many times with a point of view, you are accused of being a racist. Mm-hmm. And I think that that is something that is detrimental, and it many times starts a backlash.
Well, certainly, but I certainly would agree with that. I don't think that if people, Mr. D'Souza and I have disagreed about a great deal. but I don't have to call him a racist, and he doesn't have to call me a racist in order for us to disagree equitably. So I think that's another straw argument. There is a kind of hypersensitivity around issues of race for good reason for people who themselves have been oppressed or victimized. On the other hand, I think that there's a hypersensitivity, especially among white Americans, that to talk about race is to automatically indict them. And it's not simply a personal issue. It's a structural issue. It's an institutional issue. So I think what we have to get away from is the kind of pointing of the finger and saying, aha, thou racist, because I have now found evidence to substantiate that claim. What we're talking about are deeply rooted, intransigent realities that have institutional expression, but that also have personal basis and bias. So I think we have to separate them, but we have to talk about how they are mutually supportive of one another.
Mr. D'Souza.
Well, I think that one of the problems is that when one talks about sticking a knife in someone's back and pulling it part of the way out, the question is who's doing the sticking? In other words, to the person that this comment is directed to, they say, well, I haven't stuck my knife in anyone's back. My ancestors were in Palermo when all of this occurred. It's very interesting, but I don't see why I bear responsibility. And yet that's the point, that the allegation of responsibility is directed against people who are not culpable for the original offenses. So no one denies that the offenses have had a historical resonance. But the truncheon of racism is used very promiscuously. Even in the Texaco case, for example, it was the fear of Texaco becoming a poster boy of white racism that made Texaco settle that suit and pay up all that money. Money that would probably otherwise would have to be fought out in court. So what you have in American society is a stampede away from the accusation of racism. And that sometimes makes it difficult to address these issues candidly. Many people don't say what they believe, and there's a gap between their public assertions and their private opinions on this subject.
But that didn't begin yesterday. The gap between private beliefs and public assertions is part of what keeps white supremacy in order and running effectively. I think the machinery of white supremacy is predicated upon such a division. Let me address this, though. When I talk about the knife in the back, that's a metaphor. I guess it's like Joe DiMaggio running up to Paul Simon and saying, what do you mean, where have I been? I've been here all along selling coffee, mate. Oh, he didn't understand that he had become a metaphor and not his real body. So I'm speaking metaphorically. When we speak metaphorically about knives, we're not talking about literally people being in Palermo or not being here in America to stick the knife in the back. Excuse me for that kind of, a metaphor. What I'm saying here is the degree to which people benefit from things that happened before they came into existence. For instance, those same people who come here as immigrants are not denying protections granted to them by the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. Yet they were not there when they were put into order and when they were forced, and yet they continue to protect them. Nextly, when we talk about the degree to which African American people talk about historic injuries, again, we're put into the catch-22. If we speak publicly what we feel privately, then we're accused of being racist, and we're accused of being ethnosaurs, people who deal with outdated, outmoded forms of racial analysis because they have to pimp something in order to justify their own victimization or their own failure, more importantly. And I think that's rather ridiculous. I think the reality is in American culture that we have to confront the historic injuries and legacies of racism while talking about the persistent ways in which racial discrimination has transformed its visage to really allow it to survive in our own postmodern times. That's a different story.
Mr. D'Souza, you get the last word.
I'll go to a different story.
Okay.
This one is about scientists discovering new genes that have a tremendous impact on different diseases. And in fact, it talks about ethnic differences. It talks about, for example, a certain gene that helps to give you immunity to the AIDS virus. And apparently whites, 1% of whites, but basically no blacks or Asians have this gene. It talks about other genes that differ, for example, in between Jews and non-Jews and so on. And this seems to me to herald a much broader trend that we're seeing now, and that is the return to nature, and understanding that when one is talking about alcoholism, possibly homosexuality, and possibly to some degree even differences between, say, blacks and whites on the athletic field, there might be a genetic factor behind it. This is the ultimately politically incorrect topic, and yet it seems to me, at least at the scholarly level, it should be explored.
Well, scholars have been known to be exempt from the larger prejudices and biases that prevail in American society, so we certainly can trust them. I think that what we have to say here is that social biology has been in a force for a while, and that arguments made about genetic essentialism, that is, different biological traits that are found in blacks as opposed to whites and so on, have to be put in a larger political and social context. So I think this, as along with other arguments, have to be made with attention paid to how those arguments can be deployed to either justify existing forms and patterns of racism or to justify existing beliefs about the inherent inferiority or deficiency of black versus white.
Gentlemen, we are out of time. I want to thank you both for coming. Michael Eric Dyson is the author of this book. It is called Race Rules. He is a professor at the University of North Carolina, bachelor's degree from Carson Newman College in philosophy, and a doctorate in religion at Princeton University. He is originally from Detroit, and this is his fourth book. Also joining us is the author of this book, Dinesh D'Souza's book, The End of Racism, which has just this fall come out in a paperback along with a new essay in it. And he is also the author of Illiberal Education, The Politics of Race and Sex on Campus, born in Bombay, India. And he has a bachelor's degree in English literature from Dartmouth College. And if you don't have the book, he is also in this current edition of National Review. He has a piece called Life After CCRI. Gentlemen, first time on the Washington Journal. Thank you both for coming, and hope you both come back.
Look forward to it.
Journal returns in just a few moments.
Later in the program, we'll talk with two members of the Blue Dog Democrats about their plans for the 105th Congress. And coming up, we'll review today's headlines and take your phone calls. But first, Hillary Rodham Clinton took members of the media on a tour yesterday of the White House Christmas decorations.
Can tell the theme this year is the Nutcracker, favorite holiday tradition in our house as well as in many homes around the world. And we were very fortunate that when we sent this theme out last summer, there was such a great response. We sent requests for ornaments based on the theme of the Nutcracker to wood carvers around the country, and you can see some of the results of their work. This particular ornament is from the state of Washington, and it's in the program which all of you have. And then we also requested professional ballet companies that put on annual productions of the Nutcracker to use their imagination and creativity to come up with some ornaments that would depict the ballet. And here you have an ornament that is in the costume from the ballet of one of the ballet companies that puts on the production. And then, as we've done for several years, we had needlepoint societies take the theme of the Nutcracker and produce these stockings, and they're just exquisite. So many of them have different scenes from the Nutcracker and different ways of depicting the ballet. This ornament is a stuffed toe shoe for anybody who ever danced and put your feet into these things. You know what they feel like. And so we're very excited about the theme. And when you come back for the press parties, you'll be able to see in the red room and in the green room, and even today after we break and you have a chance to go into the state dining room and go in and hear the entertainment, you can see the mantle decorations which were prepared depicting scenes from the Nutcracker with a few liberties. And Christopher Radko, a very accomplished artist, supervised the design and construction of those particular scenes. This is the tree skirt that we had made our very first year, and we're glad it's going to be in use for 4 more Christmases after this. It has every state and territory represented by people from each of them that contributed this square. And then this is the Christmas card for the year. It's in the series that we started 3 years ago by Thomas McKnight, the blue room, the red room, and this is the green room. And you can see that, again, he's depicted the room, but he's also kind of added some of his own personal touches, like his dog, who is always invited to come when Thomas McKnight paints the room. And so we're pleased that people will be able to have this series of Christmas cards depicting these 3 rooms. When you go into the state dining room, you'll be able to see the gingerbread house, which is always a production and takes literally months to put together and cook for. And if any of you have seen the Nutcracker, I don't know how many of you have, it opens in a Victorian house where there's a Christmas celebration going on, a party of adults and children who've gathered to exchange presents and dance together and generally spend time with one another during the holidays. And so the gingerbread house this year depicts that scene, sometimes called the party scene in the Nutcracker, and you'll be able to see that when you go in there. In the press packets that you received, there are some recipes, and I think there are at least 3 of those recipes available for you to eat. And so let us know what you think about them, and then you can take the recipe cards home and try them at home. But we're just so excited to have another Christmas season. I don't think there is any place like the White House, certainly that I'm aware of, anywhere in our country that becomes as magical as this place does during the holiday season.
Washington Journal continues.
As part of the First Lady's announcement and showing of the Christmas decorations at the White House was this piece that came out in the Reliable Source column of the Washington Post. Part of what we didn't see there in that break. It says First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton in a dazzling emerald green suit and sparkly Christmas tree pen was enthusiastically describing this year's Victorian gingerbread house yesterday when Media Grinch #1 asked about her role in the upcoming welfare debate. Smell that gingerbread. You can actually smell it when you get close to it, she replied. We are back live with the Washington Journal, and we're going to open up our phone lines for our second day book and spend the next 10 minutes or so taking your calls and also talking with an Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Patents and Trademarks who is in Geneva for a special conference that will have some impact on your internet possibly in the coming years. So we would ask you to get your newspapers out and call us with the story that's interested you. Here's one we have not taken a look at this morning, and that is David Lieberman's piece on the front page of USA Today saying that cable television rates are going to rise again in January. It says it's going to have a jump of about 7% in January, even though the number of subscribers is growing at its slowest rate in decades, reflecting an industry-wide pattern. Cable's largest operators, Telecommunications Inc., Time Warner, and U.S. West Continental Cablevision have said that they will hike some rates in January. We'll begin by taking a call from Buffalo, New York. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine, thanks. What are you reading this morning?
Well, I'm reading about Mr. Supreme Court Justice Marshall, and the program he had on previous to this here with the 2 gentlemen, the 2 professors there.
Right.
Can I make a comment on racism? Okay. I'm 45 years old, white male, born and raised in Rochester, New York, and I'm a chef now for 22 years. And anyone who would dare get on the TV and say that blacks have the same opportunities as white in our society, I don't know where he comes from. He must have been on Mars or something like that and brought back with those rocks they brought back, because in my profession, I've been told by owners of restaurants throughout my 20-some years of doing this that we can't hire blacks, more than 1 black at a time, because people don't like to get food from blacks. I worked for a factory back when I first finished college in Rochester, New York, and they hired me over this other young man, and I was told that they were hiring me because I was white and that the young man was black, and they're giving me the opportunity. And I grew up in a mixed neighborhood, and I'm telling you, for the teachers to my coaches to everything, was so full of racism. Where are these people? Where are they coming from? The society is full of racism.
Buffalo, let me ask you a question. We talked a lot about the problems. Do you see solutions?
Yeah.
Go ahead. What are they?
In my case, myself, just admit that. I remember my dad sitting around the kitchen table when I was growing up, and he for some reason hated blacks, and this man never lived around blacks. He was born and raised in Watertown, New York, where I don't think there's a black up there, and this man sat around the table with his 5 kids and his wife discussing how blacks are destroying our country in the 50s and 60s. And all I did to myself was come to the realization that this is a racist society. I am probably full of racism too, and the sooner that I admit that to myself, the better I can look at myself in the mirror and say, well, think about what I'm saying, and try not to relate that to my children, which I've done, I hope, and maybe we can start creating a better society.
Buffalo, thanks for the call. Let me share with you the op-ed piece in this morning's Washington Post by Richard Cohen. He has a piece called Affirmative Reaction, and this is what he says at the end. He says, I am an ACLU Nick to my core, supporting it even when it supported the right of Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois back in 1977. But I fail to see how giving some people an advantage based on sex or race is a constitutional right. A civil liberty, in other words. To routinely choose on the basis of race or sex, no matter how noble the reason, seems wrong. Richard Cohen goes on to say, and so is the term race card. It is too often used to intimidate, to suggest that nothing but racism animates an argument or a position, when in fact it could be a different view of what constitutes racial progress. If, for instance, someone opposes affirmative action because he has been denied a job, a promotion, or an admission on account of race or sex, then that person cannot fairly be called a racist. He may, in fact, be something else instead, a victim. Richard Cohen's op-ed piece in this morning's Washington Post. Daytona Beach, you're next. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, Connie. How are you?
Just fine, thanks. What are you reading?
Listen, I'm reading the News Journal. I hate to really mention the name because it is strictly a liberal newspaper run by local people. We have no competition. We're kind of slaves to the owner, Tip Davidson, who runs the town. They run the politics. They run all the arts in the city. And the headline is, to make it short, the court to hear the gun law challenge. Well, we've talked about that this morning, I think enough. So what I'd like to mention, Connie, is the program you just had with the gentleman, D'Souza, from the American Enterprise Institute. I think that was absolutely remarkable. The dialogue in this on both sides was something to behold. This is a rare program, I think, that should be remembered in the annals of the journal.
Well, let me ask you the same thing I asked the caller ahead of you then. Well, which side do you come down on, and first of all, and what solutions do you see?
Well, what I saw here between these two people is people that are extremely well-versed in dialogue. God, I wish I could express my thoughts the way they did with that type of dialogue and rhetoric. But you've got two people here, Connie. It's the same old thing. Mr. D'Souza rationalized everything to such a degree, in my opinion, that it was absolutely remarkable and plain for any child to see. While I see the professor from North Carolina, God love him, he rationalized everything, but he reminds me of an angry man. He's just bitter about the blacks, everything about the blacks, instead of trying to do something like Mr. D'Souza explained, to self-help and to make themselves more acceptable to society. They've got an image, Connie, they've got to overcome. Now, this affirmative action baloney, you don't start that when you're grown-up people, when you're adults. Affirmative action has to start when you're children. They've got to educate, to teach, to bring these people up to be able to compete. You don't make them compete once they're grown into adults. They've lost the game then.
Okay, Daytona Beach, thank you very much for your comments this morning. Again, continued reaction to our newspaper roundtable this morning and our guests there. We're going to turn for a moment and talk about a conference that is going on in Geneva, Switzerland right now. And joining us this morning is Bruce Lehman, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary, he is Assistant Secretary and Commissioner for the Patents and Trademarks Department. He is with the Department of Commerce, and he is leading the U.S. delegation. Mr. Lehman, good morning.
Good morning.
Tell me a little bit about the importance of the conference that's going on in Geneva this week to people here who might be internet readers.
Well, the Internet is becoming a major marketplace for the sale of copyrighted products, and that's going to even become more so in the future. We're going to probably see motion pictures and sound recordings and various kinds of information products that are intended to be sold to the public, and they'll be sold over the Internet, or at least through a network environment. The Internet is something that doesn't just cover the United States. It's automatically a global phenomenon. It's a global marketplace, and because of that, we need to have global rules to cover how it works. Information products like computer programs, movies, records, and so on are protected under the copyright law of the United States and other countries. And so what we're trying to do is update international copyright law to provide a safe and effective environment for the distribution of these products on a global basis.
Is the information that we read on the Internet, that is put on the Internet and read by someone, let's say overseas on the Internet, can they currently pull that information on a non-copyright basis?
Well, everything that you write is copyrighted. Even a letter that you might write to a friend is protected by copyright law. Obviously, normally, we don't really try to enforce our copyrights. And right today, there are just billions and billions of bits of information that are flowing through the Internet, and nobody has any intention to enforce copyright. They are committing that information to the public domain, and oftentimes they want it to be widely disseminated. We're not going to do anything that's going to change that. On the other hand, if you want to use the Internet to sell somebody a computer program or to sell somebody a movie, then you're going to need copyright protection. And it's only for those kinds of circumstances that we want to make certain that we have effective copyright rules.
How many countries are represented at the conference?
There are 124 countries that are represented here.
And what countries have the tightest copyright rules?
Well, I think that today the United States and the countries of Western Europe have the strongest copyright rules.
So are there regional disagreements on this?
There are, but there's even a big need to develop a method for the European and the U.S. copyright system to work together. This isn't a question necessarily of providing, in fact, not a question at all, of providing a higher level of protection for copyrighted works than is presently enjoyed. It's largely a question of being able to see that the different laws of different countries work together in an Internet environment. You know, when you're selling a physical copy of something and you have to put it on a ship or an airplane and send it overseas, it's easy to apply different laws in different countries. On the other hand, when an information product is moving online through the network, it's in many countries at the same time. And these different countries have different legal traditions, different ways of treating things, and we need a method of understanding how the law of one country translates into the law of another country. And that's what we're basically trying to do here in Geneva.
When do you hope the negotiations to wrap up?
Well, this meeting is scheduled to conclude on December 20th, a few days before Christmas. And we hope that we will be successful on this. If we can't, we'll have to probably continue the meeting into next year sometime.
And define success.
Success would be to be able to come up with some basic rules so that we understood how the law of the United States was to be applied when a product was moving through cyberspace to France or to Germany or to England or Japan or to Chile or to China and vice versa.
Is this something that the Department of Commerce has been working on for a long time?
Yes, we have, and it's really important because, you know, a lot of Americans make their living today off the creation and sale of information products. And so we need to make certain that they have an environment where they can really take advantage of the global marketplace, maximize their earning potential.
Assistant Secretary of Commerce Bruce Lehman joining us live from Geneva this morning. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
We'll continue taking a couple calls this morning in this segment. We'll take a call next from Indianapolis. Good morning.
Morning. I want to follow suit of your two previous callers about the discussion between Mr. D'Souza and Professor Dyson. I'm an African American. I think the things that Professor Dyson was saying this morning was quite injurious to African Americans as a whole. By his own admission, he came up through the ranks. He came up and he was a guy who lived in the inner city of Detroit. He went to college. Now he's a professor at a well-known university. Now, I think that kind of hard work and tenacity is something that all blacks need to emulate, and all Americans, for that matter, need to emulate. And instead of playing the race card, we need to look at playing the economic card. Looking from the standpoint of being more economically competitive, we can start to determine and dictate our own destiny. The things that Professor Dyson says really puts people back into a position that we are not in charge of our own destiny, that it's the white Americans that hold the reins to our buggies, and that we cannot determine what path we want to go down. And until that kind of discussion changes, until we start seeing an economic responsibility for our own lives, we will always continue to have this kind of discussion.
Thanks for your call this morning. What do you do in Indianapolis?
I'm sorry?
What do you do in Indianapolis? What's your profession?
I'm a firefighter here in Indianapolis. And another thing, too, we look at from the standpoint of black Americans spend almost $16 billion a year in this economy, but yet we don't own any hotels. We do a lot of convention business, but we don't own any hotels. We need to start looking at being more economically dependent or independent from the majority. And until we start living and thinking along those lines, we'll always have our hands out waiting for the scraps and the crumbs from the table.
Indianapolis, thanks for the call this morning. We have about 30 minutes left in the Washington Journal. We'll be back in just a few moments.
Next, we'll talk with two members of the Blue Dog Democrats about their plans for the 105th Congress. But first, here's a look at some programs you can see later today on C-SPAN and our companion network C-SPAN 2.
Live from the Great Hall of the Library of Congress, a special About Books. It's a conversation with authors David Halberstam, Shelby Foote, and Peggy Noonan. They'll touch on where the country's headed in light of the elections and catch us up on what's new on the bookshelves. Plus, you'll have a chance to join in when we take your call. About Books, live Sunday, December 8th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on C-SPAN 2. For some, it was a new road. For some, a road they traveled before. And now, for members of the 105th Congress, the road to the Capitol rounds its final curve. Committees are taking shape, agendas are being set, and opening day is fast approaching. Follow the process and take a look inside the corridors of Congress with Road to the Capitol, Sunday at noon and 6 p.m. Eastern Time on C-SPAN 2.
Here's what our cameras are covering live today. Several news conferences, one recommending that President Clinton appoint an Asian American in his cabinet, and also a pair of news conferences with the newly elected Senate Republican and Democratic leaders. Also live, a discussion on innovations in American government, a forum previewing the 105th Congress, and the Heritage Foundation hosting House Speaker Newt Gingrich as he talks about the 105th Congress. We're also covering the National Cable Association as they review cable TV development over the past year. We'll have airtimes of these events throughout the day and at 8 o'clock tonight. Washington Journal continues.
In our last 30 minutes, we're joined by two members of Congress this morning, Congressman John Tanner, who is a Democrat of Tennessee, and Congressman David Minge, who is a Democrat from Minnesota. Gentlemen, yesterday there were some stories about the Blue Dogs, and a caller called in and talked about some of the stories and named some of the members of the Blue Dogs, so we thought maybe it was time that we introduced our viewers to some of them and get some of your thoughts and your plans for the coming 105th Congress. Congressman Tanner, you started the Blue Dogs in 1995. Why?
Well, there were several of us that got together and decided that many of us came here to spend our productive years to try to actually reach some solutions that face the country in terms of the problems that we as a people have to deal with, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. And we saw what we felt was too much partisanship, destructive partisanship. And so we decided we'd try to put something together that would address public policy as free of the partisan considerations as one can be in this town, on the theory that the election's over. We're here to represent all Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. And so we tried to put forward some good public policy documents that would actually try to solve some of the problems we face as the American people.
Congressman Iggy, what's the hardest part about being a blue dog?
Well, it's probably the suspicion that you find in the Democratic caucus that somehow we're going to bolt.
And go to the Republicans?
Yes,
on any issue or all
either
together?
On issues, and we have had some members that have actually switched parties. So it's trying to work within the caucus and at the same time work on a bipartisan or nonpartisan basis. And that's not easy in the political milieu here in Washington.
When did you join the Blue Dogs?
I was a part of the original founding group.
And were your reasons any different, or did you have any additional reasons than Congressman Tanner talked about?
Well, it was basically what John talked about, but I'd like to also point out that we decided that we were going to focus on the budget, trying to develop a budget that would eliminate the deficit by a time certain and do so in a forthright manner without a lot of the smoke and mirrors that have been talked about over the years. And secondly, to focus on regulatory reform and reform of the federal agencies, and not to get into the social issues. So guns, abortion, flag, these issues were off the table. These were not a part, that's not a part of what the Blue Dog Coalition is about.
Why? Why stay away from the social issues?
Well, for one thing, we don't reach consensus in our own group on some of those matters. And for another thing, we believe that the government itself is an economic model, by and large, and that some of those other matters are better left to one's own individual faith or one's own individual conscience. And those sorts of issues are very hard to reach consensus on. And so what we have tried to concentrate on, as David said, was what the government can actually do, and that is the budget. Let's get the financial integrity of this country back on track. That's one thing that we owe to those who come after us.
Congressman Mingy, let's take a look then at the budget. It'll come out in when? February?
Well, it's supposed to come out by April. Now, the President hopefully will outline his proposal, and at the same time, the Budget Committee will be working on a proposal, and it'll perhaps be several proposals. And I know that our group will have a proposal that we would like to seek bipartisan support for. And if we can't find broad support, we will promote it ourselves. And last time we had about 110 votes for the budget that we developed along with some of the other Democrats.
Will your budget plan for this coming 105th Congress be different than the one you proposed last time?
We'll probably have to update it, actually, in terms of what CBO rescores, and the baseline numbers may change some, but I would suspect the basic policies that are embodied that the numbers follow. We tried to put together a document, may I say very briefly, and David can speak to this as well, that made good sense from a policy standpoint and let the numbers follow the policy. Oftentimes here, with the debt and with the crunch, you get a number and then fit a policy to that number, and that sometimes doesn't work very well. And so we tried to develop the policy, and then the numbers will hopefully take care of themselves.
Give us some examples of the numbers and the policy.
Well, we developed a budget that balanced within the, used to be 7 years, now we're down to 4 or 5 years. I think 4 years ought to be enough given the way the deficit has been diminishing, and since we have a strong economy. We also tried to make sure that we reduced the deficit steadily each year. There were features of both the Republican congressional leadership budget and the presidential or White House budget that we were uncomfortable about. And one of the principal features was that you went along with a deficit of around $100 to $130 billion for several years, and then the last couple of years, the deficit dropped off dramatically. And the trouble was that, then you're talking about the year 2000, 2001, 2002, and many of the people that have to make the tough decisions in those years aren't a part of the decisions today, and so we're sort of postponing the real tough choices. And we thought that we ought to make those tough choices today, and we ought to make them each year until we've solved this challenge.
I'd like to open up our phone lines, invite our viewers to join us this morning. We're going to be taking some calls, letting you get to know a little bit more about what the Blue Dogs do and who they are, what some of their proposals are. Let me tell you a little bit about our two guests this morning. Congressman John Tanner is a Democrat of Tennessee. He was elected in 1988, represents the 8th District, including Union City, Jackson, and Memphis. He is going to be going on Ways and Means. Is that true?
Correct.
Just got named to Ways and Means. Is that important for a Blue Dog to be on Ways and Means?
Well, I think it is. We were glad that we had to have a seat there, and not just the Blue Dogs, but the moderate wing of the caucus. I think that it's broader maybe than just the 21 of us. Our votes actually translate into more than our number on the floor on most issues because we concentrate on policy, as David said, rather than on politics.
Congressman Tanner grew up, is it Obion County?
Obion.
I'm so, you can tell I'm a Midwesterner, can't you? I don't know any of those things. Obion County, Tennessee. He has a bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Tennessee and a law degree from the University of Tennessee. He was in the Tennessee House of Representatives for looks like 12 years?
12 years.
12 years before coming to Congress here. And also joining us this morning, Congressman David Minky, a Democrat of Minnesota, elected in '92. He represents the 2nd District, which is southwest Minnesota. Largest town is?
Wilmer.
And it says you replaced Vin Weber.
Yes.
So you came in 10. Serving on agriculture and budget?
Yes.
So you will just be going to the Budget Committee for the
I'm going
first?
to the Budget Committee next January.
And again, is that important in terms of what your goals are in terms of the Blue Dog goals?
Well, yes, it's very important. I'm a co-chair of the budget task force within the coalition, and so it'll enable me to devote more energy to that effort.
Clarkfield, Minnesota is where you grew up. He has a degree from the University of Chicago and a bachelor's degree from St. Olaf College.
Yes, St. Olaf College. I should correct that. I grew up in Worthington. I was born in Clarkfield, so my friends in Worthington would be quite miffed if I didn't acknowledge that.
And an attorney before coming to Congress. Baltimore, your first call for this segment. Good morning. Baltimore, you're on the air.
I would like to ask both of the gentlemen where they personally stand on the flying of the rebel flag in South Carolina and where they stand on affirmative action and race in general.
Mr. Tanner?
The question about the Confederate flag, I assume, relates to Columbia, South Carolina,
yes.
and the situation down there. Number one, most of us who have a moderate view of the federal government believe that many decisions that can be made at state level ought to be made there, and so I would hope that the state of South Carolina could do more than maybe we in Washington would do to address that issue. Secondly, I think that the president was correct in stating that affirmative action needs to be fixed rather than completely abolished, and I think that it can be fixed, and so I mean I would try to figure out ways that we could work together to ensure equal opportunity for all of our citizens. That's, I think, the goal of any government program.
The affirmative action question, I think, comes as an aftermath of our newspaper roundtable where we spend an hour kind of discussing these issues. Do you see Congress taking up any issues on affirmative action, major ones this year?
Well, it's tough. It's a so-called wedge issue in Congress, and I think that we're perhaps better off devoting our energies to the issues which we can unite on and don't divide us. With respect to the flag, we don't fly the rebel flag or the Confederate flag over the state capitol in Minnesota, and so I haven't really focused on that maybe as much as a caller would like. I understand it's very divisive, and I would hope the folks in South Carolina would find a different flag they could fly at the top of their state capitol.
Is Mount Juliet in your district?
No, it's next door, sort of.
Your next-door neighbor on the phone next. Mount Juliet, Tennessee, good morning.
Good morning. I have a issue that can unite us, I believe. I'm really for the Blue Dog Democrats. I appreciate their common sense approach to government. And although Representative Gordon is my representative, I hope that he goes along with you quite a bit. I think there's, my overall thrust is to reduce the size of the government, make it more efficient, and cut out waste, fraud, and abuse. And I think the Blue Dogs agree with that. yesterday in the Nashville Tennessean, there was an article in there on we're going to build a 4,600 square foot helicopter pad off of Okinawa so that we can abate the noise and give security to the Okinawans. And also then on the local news area, there was a man in Westmoreland that had determined that there was 4 people that had died being transported to the hospital from automobile accidents in Westmoreland because they lacked a helicopter pad. He needed $7,000. So I wish that the Blue Dogs would go to issues where they could kill the Okinawan helicopter pad a mile offshore and give some thought to saving the lives of Americans with investment of small amount of money locally. Thank you.
Tanner?
Well, the caller makes a good point. These issues are not either-or issues, unfortunately, and the one may or may not have anything at all to do with the other, and it's very difficult sometimes to explain, and even for us here in Congress to understand. The commitment to the Pacific Rim, militarily speaking, is one that is done in that arena, and the helicopter pad offshore in Okinawa would have to be adjudged in terms of our national security interest and that of our presence in that area. Certainly there are needs here at home, and we've tried to concentrate on those and tried to downsize the government in a way that makes sense but also provides the basic needs. I think that's maybe where the Blue Dogs disagree with some in the Republican Party who don't think the government has any role to play in some programs, frankly. We think it can. David may want to pick up on the...
No, I think you did a good job with that. Maybe we'll give the callers a little bit more time.
Let me jump into another issue that is in the news today, and that is the Consumer Price Index, and the fact that the Advisory Commission might be coming out tomorrow with a proposal that would decrease it by 1.1%. I saw in your notes that you were going to that the Blue Dogs were going to approach this as a more of a 0.5 correction. Does it matter to y'all?
Well, we've talked about this several times, and in our initial budget in 1995, we were planning to make a 1% adjustment in the cost of living index. Later, we reduced that to a 0.5%. So this is a welcome change from our perspective, and I expect that we would be quite supportive of it.
DeBerry, Florida. Good morning.
Good morning, Connie. Connie, you just asked the question that I called in to ask about, but let me elaborate a little bit. It's my understanding that the change in the CPI might affect people like me. I'm over 60. I'm on Social Security disability. I would suggest to both Representative Tanner and Representative Enge that they possibly prepare 2 sets of budgets. One that's going to be figured on the current CPI, and one that's going to be set up under what they propose if it's going to be 0.5% fine. But I think the horse is out of the corral with respect to a change coming. And I think if they continued as Blue Dogs to concentrate on only one budget estimate, and then the majority of opinion comes in and says, no, we got to recalculate based on the CPI change, then maybe they'll be left out there in the pasture without a place to put their budget.
Florida, thank you. Congressman Bingy.
Well, certainly the caller makes a good point. We need to be flexible. We need to respond to the best analysis, economic analysis that's out there, and it appears that a significant change in the Consumer Price Index is called for, and we'll work with the administration. And we'd like to work on a bipartisan basis because, as the caller indicates, this affects millions of Americans. It can become very controversial, volatile politically. Nobody wants to be identified with a change in Social Security unless it's going to provide more money to folks. And yet I think that we in Congress have an obligation to be fairly analytical and forthright and honest about what we do with the Consumer Price Index and the entitlement programs.
Another big issue that's going to be coming up in the 105th Congress is Medicare. What will the Blue Dogs propose in terms of saving the Medicare program?
In our last Congress proposal, we took what the trustees of the Medicare system said as a number in order to save the system and to make it financially responsible for the next foreseeable future. And I suspect we'll do that again. We realize that there has to be some adjustment made in the growth of the program. And we so stated in our budget proposal in the 104th, and I'm sure our policy will continue in the 105th. May I say on the CPI, what everyone I think involved with the issue is trying to do is get an accurate read so that whatever the CPI does is as accurate as can be, given the fact that economists disagree, but the large majority of economists say that it's overstated to some extent. And I think every American would like to see it just as accurate as possible.
Atlanta, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, my question for the gentleman is I'm concerned because I see an erosion of rights in this country. People seem to pick and choose which of the Bill of Rights they want to defend. For instance, people bend over backwards to protect the right to free speech. They really get up in arms if the right to bear arms is infringed upon even a little bit, to the point where deer hunters need assault rifles, I guess. And there's plenty of evidence to where gun control might be a good idea. Whereas in the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure, that just seems to be almost ignored. I think mandatory drug testing is an unreasonable search. You know, you're being searched without presumed innocence, or without being presumed guilty, and without any probable cause. You can be stopped in your car at a roadblock for no reason at all, and your car searched, your property taken from you.
Caller, what would you like to see the Blue Dogs do?
Well, I was just wondering what their thoughts were on that. I would think is if they are conservative, that they would be interested in protecting all of our rights, not just, you know, one or two. So I'd like to know what their thoughts are on that.
Well, I agree with the caller. I certainly have been a strong supporter of civil liberties and civil rights, the Bill of Rights. I don't think, however, I can say that the Blue Dog Coalition has developed a position, or I can speak for other members of the coalition. This ends up being a fairly individual position that each member of Congress takes, but I agree with much of what the caller said.
Do you meet regularly?
We meet once a week when we're here. In one or more members' offices, usually in Gary Condon's office, a member from California. And we try to get together once a week, members, so we can talk about these matters and develop policy. We've done an extraordinary amount of work on our proposals when we do take a position, reach a consensus, and that, I think, has enabled us to gain some credibility, because generally we know pretty much what we're talking about. Our budget proposal really gave us the jump start, I think, that across the country, because it was received and gained, I would say, probably 30 newspaper endorsements around the country, all over the country, in the last Congress. And as it turns out, many thought, including the Concord Coalition, which probably has no peer with respect to this issue of balancing the federal budget, supported it.
When you joined this group, did you have any idea that coming into the 105th Congress there would be quite as much attention on this 21 members?
Well, we organized the group in 1995 with the idea that we were going to try to be a policy-making entity, and that we were going to try to promote what we felt were bipartisan policies. And I'm pleased that we were able to put a budget, welfare reform, and several other things together, and I guess I'm gratified that we're receiving some attention, although it was hard to tell how much attention it would be.
San Diego, good morning. San Diego, you're on the air, San Diego.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit in this budget process that the congressmen are putting together, what consideration they give to eliminating some of the waste, fraud, and abuse in these programs. The Investors Business Daily yesterday ran an article that said that the House Committee on Government Reform and Oversight figured that $350 billion in savings were still available if the government rooted out the remaining waste and fraud.
Can you be a little bit more specific than waste and fraud?
Yes, I can. There was an audit, for example, of the Medicare expenditures, in which they have a great pot of money. And in this pot of money, they found that there were trips being made to England and Italy to review the expenditures for sculptures, and doctors going to cocktail parties with open bars, their wives attending them to conferences in San Francisco, and so on and so on. And there's also a report delivered to Representative Goodling which indicates there's a tremendous amount of waste in the school lunch program, some 40% of the food going into waste cans. Now, my concern is that the Congress as well as the administration, does not seem to have appropriate oversight over these expenditures.
Okay, thanks. Congressman Tanner.
The caller makes a good point. One of the failings of the Congresses in the past, I think, has been the inability to perform the oversight function of the executive branch that actually carries out or executes the laws Congress, the public policy Congress enacts. And I think that there ought to be more oversight, not less, from the Congress. To be honest with you, we can make public policy called the law. We cannot, from here, actually execute the policy, and so as long as human beings are prone to misbehave in some way, I think you're in a continuing motion to try to figure out how to stop the waste, fraud, and abuse. But if you're talking about human misconduct, and when it's found, it ought to be punished, excised out of the system, and go on. But that'll be a work in progress, I would suspect, David.
Again, jumping to another topic to get a feel for where you stand on different issues. Where do the Blue Dogs come down on welfare reform?
Well, we had a proposal that was supported in the end by all of the Democrats in Congress for welfare reform. And we certainly agreed that the emphasis ought to be on work, that we ought to, at the same time, invest in job training. We ought to invest in daycare. We ought to invest in transition health care so that as people move into the workforce, if they're moving to jobs that do not carry health care benefits, they don't have to go back on welfare just to participate in Medicaid. So we had a strong welfare reform proposal, and John worked very hard on that as a leader of the task force. And I also think that our proposal sort of helped broker a deal between the White House and the congressional Republicans, so in the end we actually enacted welfare reform in the 104th Congress.
How different was your proposal from the one that actually passed? Did you have a cutoff date?
Yes, we do. Ours was actually the genesis that both the Republican leadership and the White House came to accept. Neither embraced it. And quite frankly, those on the far left and far right, neither of whom liked it. What we basically did was take the disincentives for responsible behavior that were in the old system and tried to put in incentives to encourage responsible conduct in the system itself. I think we were successful in that, and I'd like to give it a chance to work.
Big morning from calls from Tennessee, another one. Townsend, do you know where that's at?
I sure do.
Townsend, Tennessee, good morning.
Good morning. How you doing?
Fine, thanks.
He's
I would
over in
like
the
to
mountains.
ask John, what are we going to do about our double dipping in Social Security? I've understood that someone could, I was born in 23, and I started paying it the day it became law, and someone else can pay it for only 5 years, 20 quarters, and draw just as much as me. And then one other problem I have with my party is I see Byrd up there that's going to build $1 billion road to nowhere, and I wondered if they have any control over things like that.
Congressman?
The caller makes a good point. I'm not familiar with the road. The Social Security system is also, may I use this word again, a work in progress. And as we look at the experts and formulate what will be another blue ribbon commission probably down the line, as we had in the late 70s, I believe, David, to try to figure out how to make that as equitable and fair as possible, given the fact that it is an older American supplementary income, and so that will be. We have a Social Security trust fund and trustees, and we'll be working with them on that one. As far as a road, you're on Transportation Committee.
Well, I'm not on the Transportation Committee, but I am also the co-chair of the Porkbusters Coalition in Congress. And so we have tried to review each appropriations bill and the transportation legislation to identify pork barrel projects. And of course, the senator from West Virginia is notorious for some of his activities, and we've been successful in eliminating some of these projects, but I'm afraid that this process out here lends itself to some abuse, and I'm not sure we're going to reach the millennium even when we come to the year 2000. There's have to be a handful of these projects that slip through, but we're going to continue to be vigilant. I'd like to assure the caller. And I'd also like to add to what John said about Social Security. I think that we recognize the Social Security Trust Fund is not actuarially sound. And we have to make some very difficult and severe corrections in the Social Security system in order to put it on a sound basis going on into the next century. It's one of the biggest challenges we face in the long term in Congress.
Let me ask you about your relationship with your colleagues who are not members of the Blue Dogs. Do you ever feel ostracized by your party?
I don't feel ostracized. I guess sometimes I feel they're more critical than that they ought to be. I think that actually we provide the opportunity for the Democrats to forthrightly address some of the most challenging and difficult issues of our nation, and that there ought to be a little bit more appreciation, perhaps, that we're willing to undertake that task, and I think give greater credibility to the Democratic Party as a sound policy formulating political body in this country.
And one that's financially responsible. Financially responsible and socially tolerant, I guess, would be what I would characterize us.
McDonough, Georgia. Good morning.
Good morning. I have to laugh there. Bill Clinton, I thought, was going to be a new Democrat, and turns out he's still a yellow dog. But anyway, my question was regarding the Education Department and how the Republicans were demonized as being anti-education during this last campaign. And it seems to me, since we've had an Education Department for the last 20 years, that it hasn't really improved test scores or the educational system around the country. And I didn't know what your position was, but it seems to me we have to get back to, let's make sure that a fourth grader knows fourth grade math or reading, etc., before being socially promoted to the fifth grade, etc. And just wondered what your position was, or your group's position was on that.
Congressman?
I agree with the caller. I was on the school board before I came to Congress in my home community, and it's a very difficult task each year to try to make sure that our local schools are operating in a fashion that we feel is responsible. I think we, by and large, have extremely dedicated teachers and administrators, and parents are interested in their kids' education. But as much as I'd like to say that at the federal level we're going to ensure that this happens, I still think that education is primarily a local and a state function, and that the federal government is there to provide support in certain areas, that the Department of Education is perhaps doing more with research when it comes to elementary and secondary education and providing some leadership nationally, but it's not there to establish mandates and then try to enforce them. So I'm not sure if I disagree with the caller in any way, but pretty much a position that the members of the Blue Dog Coalition would share with me. I will